Lightning cracked across the sky, and Alara Voss ran faster than she had ever run in her life. Her boots slid on wet stone, her lungs burned, and her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Somewhere ahead, through the sheets of rain and the black wall of trees, a rider was heading straight toward the broken bridge over Hollow Creek. If he did not stop in the next few minutes, he would ride his horse straight into the gap where the old stone bridge had collapsed 3 days ago, and he would fall 40 feet onto jagged rock and freezing water. She had seen the wreckage herself that morning. Half the bridge had simply given way, chewed apart by weeks of storms, leaving a gap wide enough to swallow a wagon. The village elders had put up a warning sign at the near end, but the far end, the end this stranger would be riding from, had nothing. No sign, no rope, no light. Just darkness and a drop that would kill anyone who did not know it was there. Alara had learned about the missing warning only an hour ago, when a boy from the eastern farms came running into Thorn Hollow soaked and shaking, saying he had seen a lone rider on the high road, moving fast, heading toward the bridge before the storm broke. Nobody else had time to spare. The men were out chasing a loose herd of cattle before the lightning spooked them into the ravine, and the old healer who usually handled emergencies had a fever that kept her in bed. So Alara had grabbed a lantern, wrapped herself in her cloak, and run. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, shaking the ground under her feet. She reached the fork in the road where the trees thinned and the land dropped away toward the creek, and there, through the rain, she saw him, a horse, black and glossy with sweat, moving at a hard trot along the ridge road. A rider, hooded, leaning forward against the wind, unaware that in less than 2 minutes he would reach the place where the earth simply stopped. "Stop!" Alara screamed, waving her lantern over her head, running toward the road with everything she had left. "Stop! The bridge is out! Stop!" The wind tore her voice apart before it could reach him. She screamed again, louder, until her throat felt raw, and this time the horse's ears flicked back. The rider slowed, just slightly, turning his head toward the sound cutting through the storm. Alara did not wait to see if he had truly heard her. She sprinted onto the road itself, directly into his path, waving the lantern in wild arcs, praying he would see her before his horse trampled her, rather than stop for her. The horse reared. The rider fought the reins with practiced strength, pulling the animal to a skidding, sliding halt only a few feet from where Alara stood, soaked and shaking, and gasping for air. For one terrible heartbeat, neither of them moved. Rain hammered between them. The horse's breath came out in white clouds, its eyes wide and rolling. "Are you trying to get yourself killed?" the rider shouted over the storm, anger and shock mixed together in his deep voice. "The bridge," Alara managed, pointing down the road with a trembling arm. "The bridge over the creek. It fell 3 days ago. If you had kept riding, you would have gone straight over the edge." The rider went very still. He looked past her, down the dark road, toward the place where the trees opened onto empty air, and a sound of rushing water far below. Even through the noise of the storm, she saw something shift in him, a flicker of understanding, followed by something colder and more controlled, the look of a man recalculating how close he had just come to dying, without ever noticing the danger. He swung down from his horse in one smooth motion, boots hitting the mud, and for the first time, Alara saw him properly in the lantern light. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made her instantly aware of how alone they were on this road. His hood had slipped back just enough to show dark hair plastered to his forehead by rain, and eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten, though she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely. "How did you know I was on this road?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though no less intense. "A boy from the farms saw you on the ridge and ran to warn the village. I came as fast as I could." She was still catching her breath, one hand pressed to her side. "You are lucky. Another minute and I would have been too late." He looked at her for a long moment, rain streaming down both their faces, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. "Then I suppose I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing," Alara said, straightening up despite the ache in her legs. "Anyone would have done the same. Not everyone would have run through a storm to stop a stranger from dying." He glanced back down the ruined road one more time, then at his horse, which was still trembling from the sudden stop. "I need another way across. Is there one?" Alara nodded, wiping rain from her eyes. There is a path through the forest that curves around the ravine and comes out near the old mill. It adds an hour to your journey, but it is safe, and I know it well enough to walk it blind. Then lead the way, he said, and I will not ask questions until we are somewhere the rain is not trying to drown us both. Despite everything, Elara felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. There was something almost calm about the way he said it, as if he had faced far worse nights than this one, and had simply decided that a little humor was the fastest way through it. She turned without another word and started toward the tree line, lantern held high, listening for the sound of hooves and boots falling into step behind her. The forest swallowed them almost immediately, the canopy cutting the worst of the rain into a softer patter against the leaves above. It was darker here, the lantern light throwing long shadows between the trunks, but Elara knew every root and rock on this path. She had walked it 100 times, gathering herbs for the village healer, in every season, in every kind of weather. Tonight, though, she was acutely aware of the man walking a few steps behind her, leading his horse by the reins, silent, except for the soft creak of leather, and the occasional word to calm the animal when thunder rumbled overhead. "You have a name?" she asked eventually, mostly to fill the silence that had started to feel heavy rather than peaceful. There was a pause just long enough that she glanced back at him. "Cade," he said finally. "And you?" "Elara." She turned back to the path, stepping carefully over a fallen branch. "You are not from around here. Your accent is different. Southern, maybe, or from one of the capital territories." "I have traveled a great deal," he said, which was not really an answer at all, but she let it go. Strangers on the road at night, during a storm, rarely wanted to explain themselves fully, and she had learned long ago not to press people who were clearly carrying more than they wished to share. They walked in relative quiet for a while, the storm slowly losing its fury above the canopy, the thunder rolling farther and farther into the distance. Elara pointed out the places where the ground dropped sharply, where roots reached up like fingers, ready to catch an unwary foot, where the path narrowed enough that Cade had to lead his horse single file behind her. He followed her guidance without complaint, without the impatience she might have expected from a man who had nearly died only 20 minutes earlier. "You seem very calm," she observed, "for someone who almost rode off a cliff tonight." "Panic rarely helps in moments like that," he said. "Better to understand what happened, learn from it, and keep moving. Falling apart afterward does not undo the danger. It only wastes the strength you need to get through whatever comes next." Elara considered that, turning the words over in her mind, as she guided them around a wide puddle that had swallowed half the trail. That sounds like something a soldier would say, or someone who has led men through worse nights than this one. Cade did not answer right away, and when she glanced back at him, his expression had closed off slightly, retreating behind whatever wall he kept around the parts of himself he did not share with strangers on forest paths. "Something like that," he said at last, and she did not push further, though her curiosity had sharpened considerably. They walked for perhaps 20 more minutes before the trees began to thin again, and the old mill came into view ahead, its broken wheel, silent and still beside the creek, which ran narrower and calmer here than at the collapsed bridge. Beyond the mill, Elara could just make out the low stone wall, marking the edge of Thorn Hollow, and beyond that, scattered lantern light, glowing warm through the rain in cottage windows. "We are close now," she said. "The village is just past the mill. There is an inn, small but warm, where you can dry off and rest before continuing your journey tomorrow." "I appreciate that," Cade said, and there was real gratitude in his voice now, the formal edges softened by exhaustion and relief. "I was not expecting kindness on a night like this." "Most people would have done the same," Elara said again, though she suspected, from the way he looked at her, that he did not entirely believe that. Perhaps, wherever he came from, kindness like this was rarer than she assumed. The thought made something in her chest ache slightly, an unexpected sympathy, for a man she had known less than an hour. As they crossed the last stretch of open ground toward the village wall, the rain finally began to ease into a gentle drizzle, and for a moment, in the strange quiet after a storm, Elara found herself studying the stranger beside her more closely. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and old, and calluses on the hand holding the reins, that spoke of a man who had done hard, physical work, or fought battles, or both. His eyes, when they caught the lantern light, held a weariness that seemed far older than the rest of him, as though he carried the weight of years he had not yet lived. "Thank you," Cade said quietly, as they reached the village gate, the wooden posts standing like sentries in the mist. "Truly, I do not think I would have survived the night without you, Alara." Hearing her name in his voice sent an odd warmth through her chest, one she did not fully understand, and did not have time to examine, because at that moment, the gatekeeper, old Hollis, came shuffling out with a lantern of his own, peering through the drizzle at the unexpected pair. "Alara? Is that you, girl? And who is this you have brought us at this hour?" "A traveler I found on the Ridge Road," Alara said, stepping forward. "He needs shelter for the night, Hollis. The bridge nearly took him." Hollis's eyebrows rose, and he studied Cade with the sharp, assessing look of a man who had guarded this gate for 30 years and had learned to read strangers quickly. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of surprise that vanished almost as fast as it appeared, though Alara did not notice it in the dim light. "Then he is welcome," Hollis said simply, stepping aside to let them pass. "Any friend the girl brings through that gate is a friend of Thornhollow." As they walked through the gate and into the sleeping village, its narrow lanes glistening under the last of the rain, Alara felt a strange certainty settle over her, quiet but insistent, that this night, and this stranger, were about to change something in her life, in ways she could not yet begin to guess. She had no way of knowing how right she was, nor any idea of the truth hidden behind the simple name he had given her on the forest path. All she knew, as she led him toward the warm glow of the village inn, was that the man walking beside her felt like someone far more important than a lost traveler who had nearly ridden off the edge of the world, and that feeling, small and quiet as it was, refused to leave her alone. The inn, called the Copper Kettle, sat at the heart of the village square, its windows glowing amber against the wet night. Smoke curled from its chimney, carrying the smell of wood smoke and baked bread, even through the drizzle, and Alara felt her shoulders relax slightly, for the first time since she had heard the boy's warning about the rider on the ridge. She pushed open the heavy door, and warmth rushed out to meet them, along with the low murmur of a few late patrons and the crackle of a well-fed hearth fire. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Petra, with flour still dusting her apron, looked up from wiping down the counter and let out a small gasp at the sight of them both, soaked through and dripping onto her floor. "Alara Voss, what in the world have you dragged in from that storm?" "A traveler who needs a room and a hot meal, Petra," Alara said, shaking rain from her cloak near the door rather than the floor. "His horse can go in the stable out back. Is there space?" "There is always space for someone who nearly drowned getting here," Petra said, already moving toward the kitchen with brisk efficiency. "Sit, both of you, before you catch your death. I will bring soup and bread, and something hot to drink." Cade thanked her with a small, courteous nod that seemed almost out of place for a man who had spent the last hour trudging through mud and rain, and led his horse toward the stable door at the side of the building, before returning to join Alara at a table near the fire. He peeled off his sodden cloak and draped it over a chair to dry, and in the firelight, without the shadow of his hood, Alara got her first real look at him. He was younger than she had first guessed, perhaps not much older than herself, though something about the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his posture even while seated, made him seem far more weathered than his years. His dark hair, drying now into loose waves, framed a face that was striking rather than simply handsome, sharp cheekbones, and a strong jaw, softened only by the surprising gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. "You keep staring," he said, though there was no offense in his tone, only faint amusement. Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks, and looked quickly toward the fire instead. "I am simply trying to understand how a man traveling alone at night, in a storm, on a road most locals avoid even in daylight, ended up needing rescue from a herbalist's apprentice. An herbalist's apprentice who runs directly into the path of a startled horse without a moment's hesitation," Cade said. "I think you underestimate yourself." "I think you overestimate how much thought went into it," she said honestly. "There was no time to hesitate. Either I stopped you, or I did not, and I was not prepared to live with the second option." Something shifted in his expression again, that same flicker of surprise she had seen in Hollis's face at the gate, though this time it lingered a moment longer before he masked it. "Most people," he said slowly, "would have thought of their own safety first." "Would they?" Alara asked, tilting her head. Or is that simply what you have come to expect? He did not answer immediately, and Petra arrived a moment later with 2 bowls of steaming vegetable soup, a loaf of dark bread, and mugs of hot spiced cider that smelled of cinnamon and something faintly stronger underneath it. The interruption seemed to give Cade time to gather himself, and by the time Petra retreated back to the kitchen, he had returned to something closer to his earlier calm. "Tell me about this village," he said instead of answering her question, breaking a piece of bread and passing half to her without seeming to think about it. "Thorn Hollow. I have heard the name before, though I confess I do not remember much about it." "There is not much to know," Elara said, accepting the bread. "We are a border village, small, mostly farmers and craftsmen. We lost a great deal during the war years ago, more than most people outside these hills probably realize. Since then we have simply tried to rebuild, quietly, without much help from anyone beyond our own hands." "The war," Cade repeated, his voice carefully neutral, though his grip on his mug tightened almost imperceptibly. "You lost people." Elara's gaze dropped to her soup, and for a moment, the warmth of the fire could not quite chase away the sudden chill that settled over her. "My parents," she said quietly, "and my younger brother. Our farm was near the eastern ridge, close enough to the fighting that when the packs clashed there, we had nowhere to run. I was 13. Old Maud took me in afterward, taught me what she could, and eventually the village healer took me on as an apprentice because I had nowhere else to go, and a stubborn refusal to simply give up." "I am sorry," Cade said, and the words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to their simplicity, as though he understood loss in a way that went beyond polite sympathy. "No one should lose that much, that young." "No," Elara agreed. "They should not. But it happened, and I have made my peace with it as best I can, though I admit some nights the peace is thinner than others." She looked up at him then, studying his face in the firelight. "What about you? You carry yourself like someone who has seen war as well. Not as a victim of it, perhaps, but as someone who has stood inside it." Cade was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as though searching for the right words, or perhaps deciding how much truth he was willing to offer a stranger who had saved his life only hours before. "I have seen more of it than I would like," he said finally. "I have made decisions in the middle of it that I am not certain, even now, that I would make the same way again. War does not leave anyone unchanged, whichever side of it they stand on." Elara wanted to ask more, wanted to press into the shadows behind his careful words, but something in his expression told her this was as far as he was willing to go tonight, and she respected that enough not to push. Instead, she let the silence settle comfortably between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft murmur of the last patrons finishing their drinks across the room. "You should eat," she said eventually, nodding at his mostly untouched soup. "Petra will be offended if you let it go cold, and trust me, you do not want to offend Petra. She controls the only decent kitchen for 3 villages in any direction." That drew a real laugh from him, low and unguarded, and it transformed his face so completely that Elara found herself smiling in response without quite meaning to. "Then I shall eat," he said, "and thank her properly before I leave in the morning." "You are leaving in the morning?" Elara asked, surprised by the small pang of disappointment the question stirred in her chest. "I have somewhere I need to be," Cade said, and the weariness returned to his eyes, older and heavier than before. "Somewhere I have been avoiding for longer than I should have. But yes, tomorrow I need to continue on, whatever the roads allow." "Then I hope wherever you are going brings you something better than what you left behind," Elara said quietly, meaning it more than she expected to. Cade looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before he finally said, "So do I." They finished their meal mostly in comfortable silence after that, occasionally trading small observations about the village, about the storm now fading outside the windows, about nothing of particular importance. Yet somehow the conversation never felt empty. When Petra came to clear their bowls, she informed them that the last room upstairs was ready, small but clean, with a proper bed and dry blankets, and Cade thanked her with the same quiet courtesy he had shown all evening. Elara rose from the table as well, suddenly aware of how late it had grown, and of her own exhaustion settling into her bones, now that the danger and the adrenaline of the night had finally faded. "I should get home," she said. "Old Maud will worry if I am gone too much longer, storm or no storm." "Let me walk you," Cade offered, already reaching for his half-dried cloak. That is not necessary, Alara said, though something in her did not entirely want to refuse. Thornhollow is safe enough, especially so close to the square. Perhaps, Cade said, but you spent an hour tonight making certain I reached safety. It seems only fair that I return the courtesy, even for a much shorter walk. She could not quite argue with that logic, and so they stepped back out into the night together, the rain now reduced to little more than a fine mist drifting under the lantern light strung along the village lanes. The walk to Old Maud's small cottage took only a few minutes, but Alara found herself grateful for every one of them, for the easy quiet that had grown between them despite everything that remained unspoken. At her door, Cade paused, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. "Thank you again, Alara," he said. "I mean that more than you know. I do not think I will forget this night, or the woman who ran through a storm to save a stranger she owed nothing to." "Safe travels tomorrow, Cade," she said softly, and something in the way he said her name, in the way he looked at her, before finally turning to walk back toward the inn, stayed with her long after she had closed her door and settled beneath her blankets, listening to the last of the rain fade into silence outside. She had no way of knowing, as sleep finally claimed her, that the man she had just said goodnight to carried a name and a title that would have made every soul in Thornhollow drop to their knees the moment they learned the truth. Nor did she know how soon that truth would come crashing into her carefully ordinary life. Alara woke before dawn to the sound of pounding on Old Maud's door, sharp and urgent enough that her heart leapt into her throat before she was even fully awake. She threw off her blanket and hurried across the cold floor, pulling it open to find Hollis standing there, lantern in hand, his face pale in the gray light of early morning. "Alara, you need to come to the square," he said, his voice tight with something she could not immediately place. "Now, quickly." "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for her cloak. "Is it the traveler? Is he hurt?" "No," Hollis said, shaking his head, though his expression did not ease. "Riders came through the gate not 20 minutes ago. A dozen of them, armed, wearing the crest of the royal pack. They are asking about a man who came through here last night, and Alara, I do not think you understand who it is they are looking for." A cold weight settled in Alara's stomach as she followed Hollis out into the misty street, her bare feet quickly finding boots she had not properly laced, her mind racing through everything she knew about royal patrols and why armed riders would be searching a border village at first light. Whatever the reason, it could not be good. Royal riders did not travel this far from the capital without serious cause, and the memory of Cade's carefully guarded words about war and difficult decisions rose unbidden in her mind. They reached the square just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to deep gray, and Alara stopped dead at the sight before her. A dozen riders indeed, their horses steaming in the cold morning air, wearing dark uniforms marked with a silver wolf crest she recognized from stories, and from the rare royal messenger who passed through Thornhollow once or twice a year. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, was speaking urgently with Petra outside the inn, and villagers were beginning to gather at the edges of the square, drawn by the commotion despite the early hour. "Where is he?" the leader was saying as Alara approached, close enough now to hear clearly. "A tall man, dark hair, travels alone. Would have arrived sometime after the storm broke last night. This is a matter of the kingdom's safety. I need to know exactly where he is." "I already told you," Petra said, arms crossed, clearly unintimidated, despite the armed men surrounding her. "He took a room here last night, but he left before first light. Said he had somewhere important to be." The leader's jaw tightened, and he turned, scanning the gathering crowd with sharp, assessing eyes, until they landed on Alara, standing frozen near the edge of the square with Hollis beside her. Something in her expression must have given her away, because the man's gaze sharpened immediately, and he crossed the square toward her in a few long strides. "You," he said, "the girl who brought him in. Petra told me as much before you arrived. What is your name?" "Alara Voss," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the pounding of her heart. "Who are you looking for exactly, and why does it matter to the crown?" The man studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to reveal, before he finally said, "I am Garrick, captain of the Royal Guard. The man you brought into this village last night is not simply a traveler girl. He is Cade Ashbourne, the Alpha King himself, returning from 5 years of self-imposed exile, and he has been missing from his expected escort since yesterday afternoon. If something has happened to him, if he has come to any harm on this road, the consequences will reach far beyond this village. For a moment, Ilara could not speak at all. The words seemed to hang in the misty air between them, refusing to fully settle into meaning. Cade Ashbourne, the Alpha King, the man whose absence had shaped half the stories she had grown up hearing, whose war had taken her family and reshaped the entire eastern border, whose return had been rumored and dreaded and hoped for in equal measure across every village within 100 miles. The man she had teased about cold soup, the man whose bread she had shared without a second thought, the man who had walked her home and thanked her by name at her own front door, as though he were nothing more than an ordinary traveler, grateful for an ordinary kindness. That is not possible, she heard herself say, though even as the words left her mouth she knew, with a sick certainty settling deep in her chest, exactly how possible it was. The calm authority in his posture, the way Hollis had looked at him, with that flicker of recognition at the gate. The scar, the calluses, the weight of years he seemed to carry despite his youth. It all fit together now with a clarity that made her feel foolish for not seeing it sooner. I assure you it is entirely possible, Garrick said, though his tone had softened slightly at the genuine shock on her face. Now please, tell me exactly where he went, and when. He left before I woke, Ilara said, her mind still spinning. I do not know where he was headed. He only said he had somewhere important to be, something he had been avoiding for too long. Garrick's expression tightened further, and he turned to bark orders at his men, sending riders in different directions to search the roads leading out of the village, while he remained behind to question Petra and Hollis further about the previous night. Ilara stood rooted to the spot, barely hearing any of it, her thoughts consumed entirely by the memory of the previous evening, replaying every word, every look, every moment she had spent with a man she now realized she had never truly known at all. She thought of the things she had said to him, the careless honesty she had offered a stranger she believed owed her nothing, and to whom she owed nothing in return. She had spoken of the war, of her family's death, of her resentment toward a crown that had, in her mind, abandoned villages like Thornhollow to fend for themselves in the aftermath of destruction. She had said all of that directly to the Alpha King himself, without the faintest idea of who was truly sitting across from her at that table, and the realization made her stomach twist with something between horror and humiliation. Ilara, Hollis's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts, gentle but insistent. Are you all right, girl? I had no idea, she said quietly, mostly to herself. He let me believe he was simply a traveler. He never corrected me, not once, even when I said things about the crown that I never would have said if I had known who he truly was. Kings rarely announce themselves on muddy forest roads in the middle of a storm, Hollis said, though there was something knowing in his expression that suggested he, at least, had suspected the truth even the night before. Perhaps he had his reasons for staying quiet. Before Ilara could respond, one of Garrick's riders came galloping back into the square, calling out that they had found tracks leading toward the eastern ridge, the same direction, Ilara realized with a jolt, that led back toward the collapsed bridge and the road he had originally been traveling before she stopped him. Garrick's expression shifted immediately from controlled worry to something sharper, more urgent. Why would he go back that way? He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, before turning to remount his horse. As he did, his eyes found Ilara again, and something in his expression softened just slightly, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the role she had unknowingly played in the king's survival the night before. Completely, Ilara confirmed. If he is heading that way without knowing, or if he believes there is another way across that he does not remember correctly, he could be in serious danger. The far side has no warning markers. Garrick's jaw tightened, and he turned to his remaining men with sharp, clipped orders that sent them thundering out of the square in the direction of the ridge road, hooves throwing up mud in the pale morning light. For a moment, Ilara stood frozen, torn between the shock of everything she had just learned and a fierce, unexpected fear for a man she had known for less than a single night. Then, without fully deciding to, she found herself moving, calling after Garrick before he could ride away. Wait. I know a faster path through the forest than the main road. I can guide you. Garrick hesitated, studying her with an assessing look that reminded her uncomfortably of the way Cade himself had looked at her the night before. This is not a walk through the woods for herbs, girl. If the king truly is in danger, this could turn dangerous quickly. I already ran through a storm in the dark to stop him from riding off a cliff, Ilara said, lifting her chin despite the fear tightening in her chest. I am not afraid of a little more danger if it means making sure he reaches safety. Please, I know these woods better than anyone in this square, and every minute we waste arguing about it is a minute closer to whatever mistake he might be about to make. Something in her tone, or perhaps in the memory of what she had already done the night before, seemed to convince him, because Garrick gave a short, sharp nod and gestured for her to mount behind one of his remaining riders. Then guide us, Ilara Voss, and quickly. If the stories about you from Petra are true, we may owe you the king's life twice before this day is done. Ilara did not have time to fully process the strangeness of that statement before she was swinging up behind the rider, gripping tight as the horse surged forward through the village gate and out onto the misty road beyond, the rest of Garrick's men falling into formation around them. The forest blurred past in shades of gray and green as they raced along the path she knew so well, her mind consumed by a single, urgent thought that overshadowed even the shock of learning Cade's true identity. She had to reach him before he reached the bridge, before whatever careless grief or determination had sent him riding back toward danger could finish what the storm had almost accomplished the night before. Whatever else was true, whatever title he carried, whatever distance now stretched between the ordinary traveler she thought she had met and the king she now knew him to be, one fact remained unchanged in her mind, burning steady beneath the fear and the confusion. She was not ready to let this stranger, king or not, die on a broken bridge she had already saved him from once. The ride through the forest felt entirely different in daylight than it had the night before. Where darkness had softened the edges of the trail, morning light now revealed every root, every stone, every place where a horse moving too fast could stumble, and Ilara found herself calling out directions with a sharpness born of pure urgency, her voice cutting through the pounding of hooves and the creak of leather around her. Left at the fork ahead, she called to the rider in front of her, gripping the man's shoulder for balance as the horse cut sharply through the trees. The path narrows after that, single file only, but it comes out closest to the ridge road. Garrick rode close beside them, his expression carved from stone, though Ilara could see the tension in the set of his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his reins that betrayed how much this search truly mattered to him. She wondered, briefly, what kind of man commanded such fierce loyalty from his guard? What history existed between Garrick and the king that made the captain's fear feel almost personal, rather than simply dutiful? "How long have you served him?" she asked, mostly to keep her own mind from spiraling into worse possibilities. "Since before he took the throne," Garrick answered without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I served his father before him. I have seen Cade Ashbourne at his best, and at his very worst, and I can tell you, girl, that whatever grief sent him riding alone into this storm, without his full escort, it was not a small thing. He does not take unnecessary risks, not since the war." The mention of the war sent a fresh chill through Ilara, and she thought again of the guarded pain she had glimpsed behind his eyes the night before, the careful way he had spoken of decisions he was not certain he would make the same way again. Whatever haunted him, it had been enough to send the most powerful man in the kingdom running from his own life for 5 long years, and enough, apparently, to pull him back into danger the very morning after he had finally begun to return. They broke from the tree line sooner than Ilara expected, the ridge road opening up ahead of them, and her heart lurched painfully at the sight that greeted them. Cade's horse stood riderless near the very edge of the gap where the bridge had collapsed, reins trailing loose in the mud, and there was no sign of the king himself anywhere along the visible stretch of road. "No," Ilara breathed, already sliding down from the horse before it had fully stopped, ignoring Garrick's sharp warning behind her. She ran toward the edge, her mind flooding with horrible possibilities, only to stop short when a low voice called out from somewhere below the ridgeline, closer to the water than she had expected. "I am here," Cade called, and relief flooded through Ilara so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. She scrambled toward the sound, peering over the broken edge of the bridge to find him standing on a narrow outcrop of rock partway down the ravine, one hand braced against the stone wall, his expression a mixture of frustration and something almost sheepish. "What in the world are you doing down there?" Ilara demanded, equal parts fury and relief warring in her voice. Retrieving something I dropped, Cade called back, holding up a small object that glinted faintly in the morning light, too far away for her to make out clearly. A foolish mistake, climbing down after it without thinking it through properly. The rock is looser than it looks. Garrick appeared at her side a moment later, letting out a long breath that sounded like it had been held since the moment they left the village. "Your Grace," he called down, his voice carrying both relief and the faint edge of exasperated affection that Alara suspected only came from years of genuine loyalty. "I would very much appreciate it if you climbed back up before either your neck or my patience finally gives out." Cade's low laugh drifted up from the ravine, and slowly, carefully, he began working his way back up the rocky slope, testing each hold before trusting his full weight to it, while Alara and Garrick watched with matching tension until his hand finally closed over the solid stone at the top, and he pulled himself back onto the road, mud-streaked and slightly out of breath, but unmistakably alive and unharmed. For a moment, nobody spoke. Cade brushed dirt from his hands, straightened, and then his eyes found Alara's, and something in his expression shifted immediately from relief into surprise, and then into something far more complicated once he registered exactly who was standing before him, and exactly what that meant she now knew. "Alara," he said slowly, the easy warmth from the night before now edged with something wary. "I see Garrick has found me rather more efficiently than I intended." "I see you have been lying to me since the moment we met," Alara said, and though she had not planned to say it so bluntly, the words came out before she could stop them, sharp with a hurt she had not fully acknowledged until this exact moment. Garrick shifted uncomfortably beside her, clearly recognizing a conversation that was no longer his to referee, and after a brief, meaningful look exchanged with his king, he stepped back toward the horses, calling for his men to begin preparing the return to the village, leaving Alara and Cade facing each other alone, on the ridge road in the pale light of the new morning. "I did not lie to you," Cade said carefully. "I simply did not correct an assumption you never actually made. You never asked if I was the king, Alara. You asked my name, and I gave it to you." "That is exactly the same as lying," she snapped, "and you know it. I told you things last night I would never have said to the Alpha King. I told you what I truly thought about the crown, about the war, about everything this village lost while the rest of the kingdom moved on without us. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to learn all of that was said directly to your face?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers despite the accusation in her voice. "I know exactly how it feels," he said finally, "because for the first time in 5 years, someone spoke to me as though I were simply a man, and not a title, and not a symbol of everything this kingdom has lost or gained. I did not correct you last night because I did not want that honesty to end the moment you learned my name. I wanted, for one single evening, to be Cade, and nothing more." The admission hung in the cold morning air between them, and Alara felt some of her anger falter, replaced by a confusion she did not entirely welcome. She wanted to remain furious, wanted to hold on to the clean, simple edges of her hurt, but the raw honesty in his voice made that far more difficult than she wished it to be. "That does not make it right," she said, though with considerably less heat than before. "No," Cade agreed quietly, "it does not, and I am sorry for the position it has put you in, Alara. That was never my intention." She studied him for a long moment, mud-streaked and wind-blown, standing on the very road where she had first stopped him from riding to his death, and found, despite everything, that she could not entirely hold on to her anger, not when it was tangled so thoroughly with relief that he had survived his second brush with danger in less than a day. Whatever complicated truth now stood between them, one thing remained painfully clear in her mind, as Garrick called for them to mount up and begin the ride back to the village. Whoever Cade Ashbourne truly was, king or stranger, or something uneasily caught between the two, her involvement with him was far from finished, and the road ahead, she suspected, would prove far more difficult to navigate than any storm-swept forest path. Word of the king's identity spread through Thornhollow faster than the storm had passed the night before, and by the time Alara returned to the village square with Garrick and his men, the entire population seemed to have gathered near the inn, whispering and craning their necks for a glimpse of the man they had unknowingly sheltered. Alara slid down from the horse on unsteady legs, more exhausted by the morning's revelations than by the physical strain of the ride, and immediately felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes shifting between her and the king riding in behind her. Cade dismounted with the same quiet composure he had shown throughout the morning, though Alara noticed the subtle way his posture changed the moment his boots touched the village square, straightening into something more formal, more guarded, as though he were settling back into armor he had shed for one brief night. The villagers parted before him instinctively, murmurs of recognition and disbelief rippling through the crowd, and several dropped into low, uncertain bows, unsure how else to greet a king they had never expected to walk among them. "Please," Cade said, raising a hand, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its quiet register. "There is no need for such formality here. Not after the kindness this village showed me last night, before any of you knew who I was." The words seemed to ease some of the tension rippling through the crowd, though whispers continued at the edges, and Alara caught fragments of conversation as she made her way toward old Maud, who had pushed through the gathering with unusual speed for a woman of her years, her sharp eyes immediately finding Alara's face and reading the exhaustion and confusion written there. "Come inside, girl," Maud said firmly, taking Alara's arm and steering her away from the crowd. "Whatever has happened this morning, you look like you need tea and a chair more than you need an audience." Alara did not resist, grateful beyond words for the older woman's practicality amid the chaos, and allowed herself to be led back toward their small cottage, while behind them, Garrick began the delicate work of organizing lodging and provisions for the royal guard, now unexpectedly stationed in a village that had never hosted more than the occasional traveling merchant. Inside the cottage, Maud set a kettle over the fire, with brisk, efficient movements, before finally turning to study Alara, with the same sharp, assessing look she had used since Alara was a grieving 13-year-old girl, arriving on her doorstep with nothing but the clothes on her back. "Tell me everything," Maud said, settling into her chair across from Alara. "All of it, from the moment you left last night." So Alara told her, the words spilling out faster than she intended, from the desperate run through the storm to the quiet dinner at the inn, from the shock of learning Cade's true identity in the square that morning, to the tense conversation on the Ridge Road afterward. Maud listened without interruption, her expression unreadable, until Alara finally fell silent, drained by the retelling as much as by the events themselves. "And how do you feel about all of this?" Maud asked finally, her voice gentler than Alara expected. "I do not know," Alara admitted honestly. "Angry, I think. Confused. He let me believe he was simply a traveler, and I said things to him. About the crown, about the war, that I never would have said if I had known. It feels like a violation of something, even if he did not technically lie." Maud was quiet for a long moment, stirring honey into the tea she had poured while Alara spoke. "I remember the day the king took the throne," she said eventually, barely more than a boy, thrust into leadership in the middle of a war that had already cost this village more than we could bear. I remember, too, the day he disappeared 5 years ago, and the stories that followed, of a king so consumed by guilt over decisions made in battle that he could no longer bear to sit upon his own throne. "That does not excuse what he did last night," Alara said, though with less conviction than before. "No," Maud agreed, "it does not excuse it, but perhaps it explains it. A man who has spent 5 years running from the weight of his own crown might understandably crave one single night of being treated as nothing more than an ordinary man, particularly by someone as fiercely honest as you, girl. That does not make his silence right, but it does make it, perhaps, a little more human than you are currently willing to allow." Alara stared into her tea, turning Maud's words over in her mind, unable to fully dismiss them despite the lingering sting of the morning's revelations. Before she could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the cottage door, and Maud rose to answer it, revealing Garrick standing outside, his expression grave in a way that immediately set Alara's nerves on edge again. "Forgive the interruption," Garrick said, "but I need to speak with Alara. It concerns matters of some urgency." Maud stepped aside without argument, and Garrick entered, removing his gloves as he glanced briefly around the small, tidy cottage before focusing his attention fully on Alara. "There has been news from the border patrol stationed along the eastern ridge," he said without preamble. "Scouts have reported movement in the contested territory beyond Thorn Hollow, movement consistent with remnants of the rival pack that fought against the crown during the war. It appears some among them never fully accepted the peace that followed, and with word spreading that the king has finally emerged from exile, they may see this as an opportunity to strike before he fully reclaims his strength and his throne." A cold dread settled over Alara at his words, and she thought immediately of the collapsed bridge, of how isolated Thorn Hollow truly was from the rest of the kingdom's protection, how vulnerable this small village would be if violence came sweeping across the border once again. "How close is the movement?" she asked, her voice tighter than she intended. "Close enough to concern me," Garrick admitted. "Close enough that I have already sent riders back to the capital requesting reinforcements, though it will take at least 2 days for additional guard to reach us given the state of the roads. Until then, His Grace has insisted on remaining here rather than pressing forward toward the capital immediately, believing that abandoning this village to whatever threat may be gathering would be an unforgivable failure on his part." Ilara's breath caught slightly at that, an unexpected warmth cutting through her lingering anger, though she pushed the feeling aside to focus on the more immediate danger. "What can I do?" she asked. "I know these woods, these roads, better than most of your men. If there is danger gathering near the border, I want to help however I can." Garrick studied her for a moment, something like respect flickering across his stern features. His Grace suggested much the same thing, he admitted. "He believes your knowledge of the terrain, combined with your standing among the villagers, could prove valuable in the days ahead, should the situation escalate. I came partly to ask if you would be willing to assist directly, coordinating with my men on evacuation routes and safe positions throughout the village, should the worst come to pass." Ilara did not hesitate, despite the fear tightening in her chest at the thought of the violence that had already stolen so much from her once before threatening to return. "Of course I will help," she said firmly. "This is my home, Garrick. I will not stand aside and watch it suffer the way it did during the war, not if there is anything at all I can do to prevent it." Something in Garrick's expression softened at her determination, and he gave a short, approving nod. "Then come with me. His Grace is meeting with the village elders now to discuss defensive preparations. Your input would be valuable there as well." Ilara rose immediately, though Maud caught her arm briefly before she could follow Garrick out the door, her sharp eyes searching Ilara's face with obvious concern. "Be careful, girl," Maud said quietly. "Whatever complicated feelings you carry toward that man, do not let them distract you from the danger gathering beyond our walls. There will be time enough to sort out matters of the heart once this village is safe." "I know, Maud," Ilara said, squeezing the older woman's hand briefly, before following Garrick out into the square, where the midday sun had finally broken through the last of the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the gathering crowd of villagers and guards, discussing the news that had swept through Thorn Hollow with the same urgency as the storm the night before. She found Cade near the center of the square, deep in conversation with Hollis and 2 other village elders, a large hand-drawn map of the surrounding region spread across a makeshift table before them. He looked up as she approached, and despite the tension still lingering between them from their conversation on the Ridge Road, something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her, as though her presence alone offered some measure of reassurance amid the mounting crisis. "Ilara," he said, straightening, "Garrick tells me you have agreed to help coordinate our defenses." "This is my home," she said simply, echoing what she had told Garrick moments before. "I am not going to stand by while it is threatened, whatever else remains unresolved between us." Something flickered in his eyes at her pointed words, an acknowledgement of the tension still simmering beneath the surface of their exchange, but he did not press the matter further, instead turning back to the map spread across the table. "Then let us begin," he said. "Show me every path through these woods that a hostile force might use to approach the village unseen, and every route we might use to move the villagers to safety, should it become necessary." For the next several hours, Ilara worked alongside Cade, Garrick, and the village elders, poring over the map, marking hidden trails and vulnerable points along the village's perimeter, discussing evacuation routes toward the more heavily fortified territory to the west, should the rumored threat prove real. The urgency of the work left little room for the personal tension that had colored their earlier interactions, and gradually, without either of them fully acknowledging it, something like an uneasy partnership began to form between them, built on shared purpose, rather than the easy warmth of the night before. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, casting the square in deep gold light, Ilara found herself standing beside Cade near the edge of the gathering, both of them studying the distant tree line where the eastern ridge disappeared into shadow, somewhere beyond which an old enemy might already be moving toward them under cover of darkness. "Are you frightened?" Cade asked quietly, not looking at her, his eyes still fixed on the distant horizon, Yes, Ilara admitted, seeing no reason to pretend otherwise. I lost my family to this same enemy once before. The thought of losing this village too, after everything we have rebuilt, terrifies me more than I know how to properly express. Cade was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. I promise you, Ilara, whatever threat is gathering beyond that ridge, I will not allow this village to suffer the way it did before. Not while I have any strength left to prevent it. You have already saved my life once. Let me return the favor. To you and to everyone here who took me in, without knowing who I truly was. Ilara studied his profile in the fading light, the determined set of his jaw, the quiet steel behind his usually guarded eyes, and felt some of her earlier anger finally begin to dissolve, replaced by something more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to trust, despite everything that had happened between them since the storm. Whatever lay ahead in the coming days, she realized, she would be facing it beside this man, king or stranger, and for reasons she was not yet ready to fully examine, that realization did not frighten her nearly as much as it perhaps should have. Then we had better make sure your promise holds, she said finally, and though her voice remained steady, something in the words carried an unspoken acknowledgement of everything shifting quietly between them, unnoticed by the villagers and guards moving around them in the gathering dusk, unspoken, but unmistakably real. Night fell quickly after that, and with it came a tension that settled over Thornhollow like a second storm, quieter than the one before but no less charged with dread. Guards took up positions along the village perimeter, their lanterns casting small pools of light against the encroaching darkness, while inside their homes, villagers spoke in hushed voices, listening for any sound that might signal the danger drawing closer from beyond the eastern ridge. Ilara spent the early evening moving between houses with Garrick's second-in-command, a steady young guard named Ivo, confirming that every family understood the evacuation route toward the western hills should the alarm bell ring. It was careful, exhausting work, made heavier by the fear she could see in every face she passed, fear she remembered too well from her own childhood, though she forced herself to project calm confidence for the sake of the frightened children clinging to their parents' hands in doorways along the lane. By the time she finished her rounds, full dark had fallen, and she found herself drawn back toward the square, where a small fire had been lit near the well, around which Cade sat with Garrick and a handful of guards, studying the map once more by flickering firelight. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression eased at the sight of her, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "Any trouble along the perimeter?" he asked. "None yet," Ilara said, settling onto a nearby bench, suddenly aware of how tired she truly was. "Everyone knows the evacuation route. Hollis has the bell ready at the first sign of trouble." Cade nodded, though his eyes remained distant, fixed on some point beyond the firelight, and Ilara recognized in his expression the same haunted weight she had glimpsed the night before, back when she still believed him nothing more than a tired traveler. "You are thinking of the war," she said quietly, not quite a question. "I am thinking of every mistake I made during it," he admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, over the crackle of the fire and the murmur of the guards a short distance away. "Decisions that seemed necessary at the time, that cost lives I still carry with me every single day. If the enemy truly is gathering beyond that ridge, if this village suffers because of choices I made 5 years ago, I do not know how I would live with that weight added to everything else." "You cannot control what happened in the past," Ilara said, surprising herself with the gentleness in her own voice. "But you can control what happens now. You are here, Cade. You did not have to stay. You could have continued on to the capital and left Garrick's reinforcements to handle whatever comes. Instead, you chose to stand with us. That matters more than you seem willing to believe." He turned to look at her then, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his eyes in the firelight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither fully understood nor was ready to name. Before either could break the silence, a sharp, urgent shout cut through the night from the direction of the eastern perimeter, followed almost immediately by the frantic clanging of the alarm bell. Cade was on his feet instantly, all traces of vulnerability vanishing behind the sharp, commanding focus of a man who had led armies before. "Positions," he barked to the guards around the fire, who scattered immediately toward the eastern edge of the village, while Garrick grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her toward the center of the square where the evacuation route began. "Get the villagers moving," Garrick ordered her, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Now, Elara. This is exactly what we prepared for." Elara did not hesitate, running toward the nearest cluster of cottages, calling out the warning as she went, watching doors fly open as families emerged, clutching whatever belongings they had gathered, in anticipation of this exact moment. Children crying, elders moving as quickly as their legs allowed, toward the western road that would carry them to safety beyond the hills. The organized chaos of the evacuation swirled around her, and she found herself moving on pure instinct, guiding an elderly couple toward the road, scooping up a toddler separated from his mother in the confusion, and depositing him safely into her arms, checking doorways to ensure no one had been left behind in the panic. From the eastern edge of the village, she could hear the sounds of confrontation beginning, shouted orders, the clash of something that might have been weapons meeting weapons, and her heart clenched with fear for Cade and Garrick and the guards who had rushed toward the danger rather than away from it. But there was no time to dwell on that fear, not with dozens of frightened villagers still needing guidance toward safety, and so she pushed the worry aside and continued her work, moving from house to house with an efficiency born of pure necessity. It felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, before the sounds of fighting began to fade, replaced eventually by Garrick's voice carrying across the square, calling out that the threat had been repelled, that the attackers, a small scouting party, rather than the full force Garrick had feared, had been driven back toward the ridge with minimal injury to the village's defenders. Relief swept through the gathered crowd like a physical wave, and Elara felt her knees nearly buckle beneath the sudden release of tension she had been holding since the alarm bell first rang. She found Cade near the well a short while later, a shallow cut along his forearm, the only visible sign of the confrontation, his expression grim, despite the victory Garrick had announced. "You are hurt," Elara said immediately, moving toward him without thinking, already reaching for the small healer's satchel she always carried out of long habit. "It is nothing," Cade said, though he did not pull away as she began cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency, her hands steady, despite the lingering adrenaline still coursing through her. "A scouting party only, as Garrick said. They were testing our defenses, nothing more. But it confirms what we feared. Someone beyond that ridge knows I have returned, and they are not willing to let that return go unchallenged. Then we will simply have to be ready for whatever comes next," Elara said, wrapping a clean bandage around his forearm with careful, sure movements. "This village has survived worse than a scouting party, Cade. We will survive this too." He watched her work in silence for a long moment, something in his expression shifting into an emotion she could not quite name, warmer and more open than the careful composure he usually maintained. "I am beginning to understand," he said quietly, "why this village managed to rebuild itself so thoroughly after everything the war took from it. It has people like you holding it together." Elara felt heat rise to her cheeks, despite the exhaustion weighing on her, and she busied herself with tying off the bandage, rather than meeting his eyes directly. "It has people like all of us," she corrected. "No village survives on the strength of one person alone." "Perhaps," Cade allowed, though the way he continued to watch her suggested he was not entirely convinced. Around them, the square slowly began to settle, as villagers, having heard the news of the repelled attack, began making their cautious way back from the western road, exhausted but relieved, and Elara found herself grateful for the distraction, grateful for anything that might pull her attention away from the way her heart continued to race, despite the ended danger, for reasons that had very little to do with fear any longer. As the night wore on, and the village slowly settled back into an uneasy peace, guards doubling their watch along the perimeter in anticipation of further trouble, Elara understood with growing certainty that whatever storm had first brought Cade Ashbourne into her life, the danger surrounding them now was far from finished, and neither, she suspected, was whatever had begun quietly growing between them, despite every reason either of them had to guard against it. Morning brought no comfort, only a heavier kind of quiet stretched across Thorn Hollow, the sort of silence that follows danger, without yet promising safety. Elara woke stiff and sore from the previous night's chaos, her body protesting every movement as she dressed, and made her way toward the square, where Garrick had summoned the village elders and several of his senior guards for an early council regarding the captured scout. They had taken one prisoner during the skirmish, a young man barely older than Elara herself, wounded but alive. now held under guard in the small storeroom behind the inn that had been hastily converted into a makeshift cell. Alara arrived just as Cade emerged from questioning him, his expression carved from granite, the easy warmth she had glimpsed the night before completely absent from his sharp, focused features. "What did he say?" Garrick asked immediately, falling into step beside his king as they crossed toward the gathered elders. "Enough to confirm my worst suspicions," Cade said grimly. "The scouting party was sent by Malric Draven, a commander who served under the old enemy pack during the war, and refused to accept the peace treaty that ended it. He has spent the past 5 years gathering loyalists in the wild territories beyond the border, waiting for an opportunity to strike back against the crown. My return from exile, and the weakness he perceives in it, has apparently given him exactly the excuse he needed." Ilara's stomach tightened at the name, memories of the war stirring unwelcome and sharp in her mind. She had heard whispers of Malric Draven before, a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones by the older villagers who remembered the worst of the fighting. A man whose cruelty during the conflict had become the stuff of grim legend along the border territories. "How large is his force?" one of the elders asked, worry etched deep into his weathered face. "Larger than a single village should have to face alone," Cade admitted, his jaw tight. "Which is precisely why I have already sent word requesting the reinforcements be doubled, and why I intend to remain here myself until the situation is fully resolved, rather than continuing on to the capital as originally planned." A ripple of surprise passed through the gathered elders at his words, and Alara felt her own breath catch slightly, an unexpected warmth cutting through her lingering worry. Cade caught her eye briefly across the gathering, something unspoken passing between them, before he turned his attention back to the council, discussing logistics and defensive strategies with the same steady focus he had shown the night before. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparation, guards reinforcing the village perimeter, villagers organizing supplies in case of a prolonged siege, and Alara found herself once again working alongside Cade and Garrick, her knowledge of the surrounding terrain proving invaluable as they mapped out defensive positions and potential ambush points along the routes an approaching force might use. The shared purpose that had begun forming between her and Cade the day before deepened further through the shared urgency of their work, and though the underlying tension of the coming threat never fully faded, Alara found unexpected moments of ease in his company, brief exchanges of quiet humor, or simple companionship that felt entirely separate from the crown he carried. It was during a rare pause in the afternoon, while they stood together examining a section of the village wall in need of reinforcement, that Alara finally found the courage to ask the question that had been quietly gnawing at her since the night before. "Why did you really leave the throne?" she asked, watching his profile carefully. "Garrick said something about decisions during the war, mistakes you have not forgiven yourself for, but he never explained what actually happened." Cade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the wall before them, though Alara suspected he was seeing something far more distant. "There was a battle," he said finally, his voice low and careful, "near the end of the war, at a village not unlike this one, along a different stretch of the border. I received intelligence that the enemy was gathering a large force there, preparing to strike deeper into our territory. I made the decision to move our own forces to intercept them before they could advance, believing it would save countless lives further inland." He paused, his hands tightening briefly on the stone wall before him. The intelligence was wrong. The force gathering there was smaller than reported, a decoy meant to draw our attention while the real assault struck elsewhere, at a village that had been left with minimal defense because I had redirected our strength to meet a threat that barely existed. By the time we realized the mistake and repositioned, it was already too late. The village fell before we could reach it. Many died who would have survived if I had made a different choice. Alara's breath caught, understanding dawning slowly as she connected his words to the guilt she had glimpsed behind his eyes since the very first night. "You believe that mistake makes you unfit to rule," she said quietly. "I believed, for a long time, that I could not trust my own judgment enough to be responsible for so many lives again," Cade admitted. "So I left. I told myself I was protecting the kingdom from further mistakes by removing myself from the throne. But if I am honest, Alara, I think I was simply running from the weight of what I had done, hiding from a grief I did not know how to carry, while still expected to lead." "And now," Alara asked softly, "what changed? Why return now, after 5 years?" "I received word that the council intended to name a permanent regent if I did not return within the year, Cade said. A decision that would have fractured the kingdom's stability for a generation. I realized, finally, that hiding from my failures was simply creating new ones, different in shape, but no less damaging than the mistake I made during the war. So I decided it was time to stop running, however unprepared I still felt to face what waited for me. Alara studied him for a long moment, understanding now the exhaustion she had glimpsed in his eyes since the very first night on the Ridge Road, the weight of guilt he had carried alone for 5 long years, without anyone to share its burden. You made a mistake during a war, Cade, she said finally, choosing her words with care. A terrible one, yes, with consequences you will likely carry for the rest of your life. But running from your throne did not undo that mistake, and it did not honor the people you lost either. Coming back, facing the weight of it, trying to do better, that honors them far more than exile ever could. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a flicker of something that looked almost like relief, as though hearing the thought spoken aloud by someone else made it easier to believe than it had been to tell himself alone, in the quiet of his own guilt. You have a remarkable gift, he said softly, for saying exactly what needs to be heard, even when it is not comfortable to hear. I have had a great deal of practice being honest with people who would rather I was not, Alara said, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite the heaviness of the conversation. It rarely makes me popular, but it has served me well enough. Cade's answering smile was small but genuine, warming something in Alara's chest that she was still not fully ready to examine. Before either of them could say more, a shout from the eastern watchtower cut through the afternoon quiet, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound, tension immediately replacing the fragile intimacy of the moment before. A guard came running toward them, breathless, relaying word that riders had been spotted approaching from the Ridge Road, though these, unlike the scouting party from the night before, carried the crest of the Royal Guard rather than any enemy banner. Relief swept through Alara at the news, quickly followed by cautious hope as they made their way toward the gate to confirm the arrival of the reinforcements Garrick had requested. The riders proved to be exactly what they hoped, a full company of Royal Guard led by a stern-faced commander who greeted Cade with immediate, formal deference before delivering news that both eased and complicated the situation further. Additional forces were being mobilized from the capital, expected to arrive within the next 2 days, more than enough to fully secure Thornhollow and push back any further advance from Malric Draven's gathering forces. However, the commander also carried word from the Royal Council, urgent messages demanding Cade's immediate return to the capital, given the confirmed threat to his safety. Arguments that his continued presence in a border village under active threat represented an unacceptable risk to the kingdom's stability. Alara watched Cade's expression carefully as he listened to the commander's report, seeing the familiar tension return to his shoulders, the weight of duty pressing back down upon him, even as the immediate danger began to ease. She understood, with a sinking feeling she did not entirely welcome, that the fragile world they had built together over the past 2 days, this strange, urgent partnership forged in shared danger and quiet honesty, was about to be tested by forces far beyond either of their control. I will consider the council's request, Cade told the commander finally, though his eyes flickered briefly toward Alara before returning to the officer before him. But I will not abandon this village while the threat against it remains active. Thornhollow took me in as a stranger and fought beside me as an ally. I will not repay that with abandonment now. The commander's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his posture suggested he had expected exactly this response and had already prepared himself to relay it back to an unhappy council. As he turned to organize his men and begin coordinating with Garrick on the village's expanded defenses, Alara found herself standing quietly beside Cade, watching the flurry of activity spreading through the square, aware of a complicated tangle of gratitude and worry twisting together in her chest. Whatever came next, whatever pressure the capital continued to exert, whatever danger Malric Draven's forces still represented beyond the eastern ridge, one thing had become undeniably clear to her over the past 2 days. The man standing beside her, king though he might be, had chosen this village, had chosen her honesty and her home over the safety and comfort of retreat, and that choice, however complicated its consequences might prove, had already changed something fundamental in the careful, guarded life she had built for herself since losing everything during the war that had first brought them, unknowingly, to this exact moment. That evening, as the newly arrived guards settled into makeshift quarters around the village and the reinforced perimeter finally allowed for a measure of genuine rest, Ilara found herself unable to settle despite her exhaustion. She wandered toward the edge of the village instead, past the last of the cottages, to where a low stone wall overlooked the fields beyond, silvered now under a sky finally clear of storm clouds, stars scattered thick and bright overhead. She was not entirely surprised when she heard footsteps approaching behind her a short while later, nor when Cade settled onto the wall beside her without asking permission, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him against the cool night air. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fields sway gently in the breeze, the tension of the day slowly draining from both their shoulders. "The council will not stop pressing until I return," Cade said eventually, breaking the quiet. "They are not wrong to worry. A king killed on some border road would leave the kingdom in chaos, far worse than anything Malric Draven could accomplish through open attack." "Do you want to leave?" Ilara asked, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to hear the answer. "No," Cade said, without hesitation this time, and something in the certainty of his voice eased a worry Ilara had not fully acknowledged she was carrying. "I spent 5 years running from responsibility, Ilara. I am not eager to prove the council right by running from this village the moment real danger arrives. But I also cannot ignore the weight of what my death would mean for everyone who depends on the throne remaining stable." "Then we will simply have to make certain nothing happens to you," Ilara said firmly, echoing the same fierce determination she had felt since the night she first pulled him from the path of disaster on the Ridge Road. Cade turned to look at her then, something warm and unguarded flickering across his features in the starlight. "You keep saving my life," he said softly, "in one way or another. I am beginning to wonder what I did to deserve such determined protection from a woman, who, by all rights, should still be furious with me for the way we met." "I am still somewhat furious with you," Ilara admitted, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "But it turns out furious and worried can exist in the same heart without canceling each other out. Who would have guessed?" His answering laugh was soft, genuine, and for a moment, sitting together on the quiet wall beneath a sky finally free of storms, the weight of crowns and wars and gathering enemies seemed to recede just slightly, leaving only two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, begun to matter a great deal to one another, in the span of only a few extraordinary days. The scream tore Ilara from sleep before dawn on the third day, sharp and terrified, followed immediately by the frantic ringing of the alarm bell echoing across the village. She was on her feet and reaching for her boots before her mind had even fully processed the sound. Years of instinct, honed by loss, driving her body into motion, faster than conscious thought could catch up. Outside, chaos had already begun to spread through the lanes of Thorn Hollow. Guards shouting orders, villagers stumbling from their homes in various states of undress and panic, and above it all, a sound Ilara had hoped never to hear again in her lifetime, the distant but unmistakable roar of a large force approaching through the darkness beyond the eastern ridge. This was no scouting party testing defenses. This was Malric Draven's true strength, finally arrived, and far sooner than anyone had anticipated. She found Garrick near the square, already fully armed, barking orders to guards positioning themselves along the reinforced perimeter, his face grim in the torchlight. "How many?" Ilara demanded, falling into step beside him. "More than we prepared for," Garrick admitted, not bothering to soften the truth. "Our scouts estimate at least 3 times the force we expected, moving fast, clearly intending to strike before our full reinforcements from the capital can arrive. We have perhaps an hour, if we are fortunate." Cold dread settled deep in Ilara's stomach, but she pushed it aside, forcing her mind toward the practical urgency of the moment, rather than the fear threatening to overwhelm it. "Where is Cade?" she asked. "Coordinating the defense at the eastern wall," Garrick said. "He refused to retreat to safety, despite my strong objections. I need you organizing the evacuation again, Ilara, exactly as before, but faster this time. We do not have the luxury of a slow, orderly departure." Ilara did not waste time arguing, immediately turning to begin the desperate work of rousing families and guiding them toward the western road, her voice hoarse within minutes from shouting over the growing chaos, her hands trembling, despite her outward composure, as she helped an elderly widow gather what few belongings she could carry, as she scooped up crying children and pressed them into the arms of older siblings tasked with leading them to safety. The memory of another night, years ago, when no one had come to warn her own family in time, drove her forward, with a desperation that left no room for exhaustion or fear, only the singular, burning need to make certain this village did not suffer the same fate hers had. The sound of fighting erupted from the eastern perimeter as she worked, sharper and more sustained than the brief skirmish 2 nights before, and every distant clash sent a fresh spike of terror through her chest for Cade's safety, though she forced herself to keep moving, to keep guiding villagers toward the road, trusting that Garrick's men and the newly arrived reinforcements would hold the line long enough for the evacuation to succeed. She was helping the last family from the eastern lane toward the road when a guard came sprinting toward her, blood streaked across his temple, breathless with urgency. "Elara," he gasped, "the king ordered me to find you." The eastern wall is holding, but Malric Draven himself has been spotted leading a smaller group attempting to circle around through the northern forest path, the one that leads directly toward the evacuation road. If they reach it before the villagers clear the area, it could turn into a slaughter. Elara's blood ran cold. She knew that path intimately, had walked it 100 times gathering herbs, and understood immediately its danger. A narrow, winding trail that ran parallel to the evacuation road for nearly half a mile, before finally diverging, close enough that an attacking force moving along it could easily intercept fleeing villagers before they reached safety. "How many guards are positioned there?" she asked, already moving toward the northern edge of the village. "None," the guard admitted grimly. "All our forces are concentrated at the eastern wall. Garrick did not anticipate the northern path being used, not with the terrain being as difficult as it is." Elara's mind raced, weighing the danger against the desperate need to protect the fleeing villagers, and within seconds, she had made her decision, one that left no room for hesitation, despite the fear pounding through her veins. "Get to Garrick," she told the guard. "Tell him he needs to send reinforcements to the northern path immediately. I am going to try to slow them down until help arrives." The guard's eyes widened with alarm. "Elara, you cannot go alone. That is madness. Malric Draven's men are trained soldiers. You would not stand a chance against—" "I am not planning to fight them," Elara cut him off, already moving. "I know that forest better than anyone. I can lead them off the direct path. Buy time, create confusion. Just get Garrick moving, now, please. There is no time to argue further." She did not wait for his response, sprinting instead toward the tree line at the northern edge of the village, her lantern abandoned, in favor of the faint gray light beginning to touch the eastern sky, her heart hammering with a fear she refused to let slow her steps. She knew this forest, knew every hidden trail and shortcut, every place where the terrain grew treacherous enough to slow even determined pursuers, and she intended to use every scrap of that knowledge to buy the fleeing villagers whatever time she possibly could. She reached the northern path just as the first sounds of movement reached her ears from further along the trail, low voices, the crack of branches underfoot, a force moving with purposeful speed through the pre-dawn darkness. Elara pressed herself against the trunk of a wide oak, forcing her breathing steady despite the terror clawing at her chest, and waited, watching as shadowy figures began to emerge from the deeper darkness of the trees ahead. There were perhaps a dozen of them, moving with the disciplined efficiency of trained fighters, and at their head, unmistakable even in the dim light, walked a broad-shouldered man whose bearing radiated a cold, calculated menace that made Elara's skin crawl with recognition, though she had never laid eyes on him before this moment. Malric Draven himself, closer to the fleeing villagers than anyone in the village yet realized. She had only moments to decide her next move, and she chose the only option that felt survivable, slipping quietly away from the oak and moving parallel to the group, along a narrower deer trail she knew ran close enough to draw their attention if she moved carelessly, deliberately snapping a branch beneath her boot as she went, then immediately freezing as the group's low conversation cut off sharply. "Someone is there," a voice called out, tense with alert suspicion, and Elara's heart lurched painfully as she heard the group shift direction, moving toward the sound she had deliberately created, exactly as she had hoped, drawing them away from the direct path toward the evacuation road and its precious cargo of frightened villagers. She moved again, quick and quiet, deeper into the forest along a trail she knew would eventually loop back toward the village rather than continuing outward, praying the darkness and her own careful footing would keep her hidden long enough for the deception to work, long enough for Garrick's reinforcements to arrive and secure the northern approach before Malric's men realized they had been led astray by nothing more than a single frightened woman using every trick a lifetime in these woods had taught her. For several agonizing minutes, the pursuit continued, Ilara staying always just out of clear sight, leading the group deeper into terrain that grew increasingly difficult, praying her knowledge of the ground would prove enough of an advantage against trained soldiers moving in unfamiliar territory. She could hear them growing closer at times, their frustration mounting audibly as the forest swallowed whatever trail she left behind, and twice she nearly stumbled into full view, catching herself only through desperate, silent effort that left her lungs burning and her legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. Then, finally, she heard it, the sound she had been praying for, the thunder of approaching hooves, and the shouted commands of Garrick's reinforcements crashing through the forest from the direction of the village, drawn by the sounds of pursuit echoing through the trees. Malric's men froze at the sound, clearly recalculating their odds now that the element of surprise had been lost, and within moments, Ilara heard the group begin retreating back toward the deeper forest, abandoning their attempt to circle around toward the evacuation road, now that reinforcements had arrived to secure it. She allowed herself only a moment of relief before pushing forward toward the sound of the arriving guards, emerging from the tree line just as a mounted patrol crashed into the clearing, weapons drawn, clearly prepared for combat that had already retreated beyond their reach. At their head, unmistakable even through the chaos, rode Cade himself, his expression shifting from fierce readiness to stunned horror the moment his eyes found her standing alone at the edge of the trees. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the distance between them in a few long strides, his hands finding her shoulders with a desperate urgency that spoke louder than any words could have. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes rapidly scanning her for injury. "What in the world were you thinking, coming out here alone?" "Ilara." Malric Draven himself was leading that group. "I know exactly who was leading it," Ilara said, her voice shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, and the full weight of what she had just done was finally catching up to her trembling limbs. "That is precisely why I could not simply wait for reinforcements." They were minutes from reaching the evacuation road, Cade. "I did what needed doing." "You could have been killed," Cade said, his voice rough with an emotion that went far beyond simple concern for an ally, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders, as though he needed the physical contact to fully believe she truly stood before him, unharmed. "So could you, standing at that eastern wall," Ilara countered, though the sharpness in her voice had already begun softening into something gentler, something that matched the raw fear still evident in his own expression. "We are both taking risks tonight that no reasonable person would recommend. I suppose that makes us a fairly matched pair." Something in his expression cracked open at that, relief and fear, and an emotion Ilara did not yet dare to name all warring together behind his eyes, and before either of them fully processed what was happening, he had pulled her into his arms, holding her close enough that she could feel the rapid, unsteady beat of his heart against her own chest. She did not pull away, allowing herself, for just a moment, to lean into the solid warmth of him, into the relief of having survived a danger that could easily have ended very differently. "Do not do that again," Cade murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion he had clearly not intended to reveal so openly. "I have lost enough people I care about, Ilara. I cannot bear the thought of losing you too, especially not to a danger you ran toward entirely alone." The admission hung between them, heavier and more significant than either of them seemed fully prepared to address, in the middle of a forest clearing surrounded by mounted guards, but Ilara found she could not bring herself to regret hearing it, nor to pull away from the warmth of his arms around her, despite the danger still simmering beyond the village's borders. Whatever this fragile, complicated thing growing between them truly was, it had survived a war's worth of danger in only a handful of days, and standing there in the pale light of a dawn that had nearly brought disaster to everyone she loved, Ilara found herself hoping, fiercely and against every cautious instinct she usually trusted, that it might somehow survive whatever still lay ahead. They did not have long to linger in that fragile moment. A rider arrived moments later from the eastern wall, breathless with news that the main force under Malric Draven's lieutenants had begun a full assault against the village perimeter, testing the defenses with a ferocity that suggested the enemy commander intended to force a breach before the sun fully rose, and revealed the true size of the reinforcements, now defending Thornhollow. Cade released her reluctantly, the warmth in his eyes hardening back into the focused determination of a commander facing battle. "I have to go," he said, though something in his voice suggested he wished, just for a moment, that duty allowed for a different choice. "Stay here with the reinforcement patrol until it is safe to return to the village." "I am not hiding in the forest while my home is under attack," Elara said immediately, her chin lifting with the same stubborn determination that had carried her through every danger of the past 3 days. "I know how to bind wounds, Cade. If there is fighting at that wall, there will be injured who need help far more urgently than I need protecting." He studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the urge to keep her safely away from the danger and the recognition that arguing would waste precious time neither of them could afford. Finally, he gave a short, reluctant nod. "Stay behind the line," he said. "Please, Elara. I cannot fight properly if I am worried you have wandered into the thick of it." "I promise," she said, and meant it, though the promise did little to ease the fear twisting through her chest as they mounted up and rode hard back toward the village, the sounds of battle growing louder and more chaotic with every passing moment. The scene that greeted them at the eastern wall was one of controlled chaos, guards locked in fierce combat along the reinforced perimeter, the clash of weapons and shouted commands filling the gray dawn air with a violence that made Elara's stomach clench painfully with memories she had spent years trying to bury. She forced herself past the fear, immediately moving toward the makeshift medical station Petra and several other village women had established near the square, where the first wounded were already being brought in, some limping under their own power, others carried by comrades with expressions grim enough to leave no doubt about the severity of the fighting. She threw herself into the work without hesitation, her healer's training finally proving its worth in circumstances far more dire than she had ever imagined facing, cleaning wounds, applying pressure to stop bleeding, offering quiet, steady reassurance to frightened young guards who had never before faced true combat and now found themselves confronting its brutal reality for the first time. The hours blurred together in a haze of urgent, focused work, the sounds of battle continuing beyond the makeshift medical station, rising and falling in intensity as the defenders held their ground against wave after wave of Malric Draven's determined assault. It was well past midday before the tide of the battle finally began to turn, word spreading through the exhausted defenders that the additional reinforcements from the capital, arriving earlier than expected, had struck Malric's forces from the rear, catching them in a pincer that finally broke the momentum of the assault and sent the surviving attackers scattering back toward the eastern ridge in full retreat. Cheers rose from the exhausted guards still holding the wall, relief and disbelief mingling in equal measure as the reality of survival slowly settled over the battered village. Elara did not fully allow herself to believe the danger had passed until she saw Cade himself striding toward the medical station sometime later, exhausted and battle-worn, but unmistakably alive, a shallow cut across one cheekbone, the only visible mark of the fighting he had endured. Relief crashed over her with such force that she nearly stumbled forward to meet him, catching herself only at the last moment, suddenly aware of dozens of watching eyes among the wounded and the healers working around them. "It is over," Cade said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion, though carrying an unmistakable note of relief. "Malric's forces are retreating, scattered enough that Garrick believes it will be some time before they attempt anything so bold again. The reinforcements are pursuing them beyond the ridge to ensure they do not regroup nearby." "And the village?" Elara asked, though she already suspected the grim answer even before he spoke it. "We lost people," Cade said quietly, his expression heavy with the weight of it. "Not as many as I feared, but more than I wanted. I will need to speak with the families personally once matters here are settled." Elara reached out without fully thinking, resting her hand against his arm in quiet comfort, and he covered it with his own, holding on for a long moment, as though drawing strength from the simple contact. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "This village stood because you chose to stay and fight for it, Cade. That is not nothing, especially not to the families who still have their loved ones tonight because of choices you made these past 3 days." He looked at her then, something in his expression shifting into an emotion far too raw and complicated to fully name in the middle of a battlefield's aftermath, surrounded by wounded and exhausted survivors, slowly beginning the long process of tending to both their bodies and their grief. Whatever words either of them might have offered in that moment remained unspoken, interrupted by Garrick's arrival with an update on the retreating enemy forces. But the look that passed between them carried its own quiet promise, one that neither the exhaustion of battle nor the uncertain days still ahead seemed capable of erasing. 3 days passed before Thornhollow began to feel like itself again, though the scars of the battle remained visible everywhere Alara looked, scorched patches along the eastern wall where fires had briefly caught before being extinguished, fresh graves marked with simple wooden crosses in the small cemetery beyond the village chapel, the quiet, careful way villagers moved through their days now, still watching the eastern ridge with wary eyes despite Garrick's assurances that Malric Draven's remaining forces had scattered too thoroughly to regroup anytime soon. Alara spent those days mostly among the wounded, working alongside the village healer, whose fever had finally broken enough to allow her back into limited service, tending injuries that ranged from minor to severe, offering what comfort she could to families grieving losses that echoed, painfully, her own history. It was exhausting, heartbreaking work, but it also offered a strange kind of solace, the familiar rhythm of healing, providing an anchor amid the emotional upheaval of everything that had happened since the storm first brought Cade into her life. She saw him only in brief moments during those first days, both of them consumed by the urgent work of recovery, though every stolen glance across the square, every brief exchange of quiet words as their paths crossed, carried a weight that neither of them yet dared to fully address. The council's demands for his return to the capital had only intensified following news of the attack, urgent messengers arriving daily with increasingly insistent requests, but Cade continued to delay, citing the village's ongoing need for stability and the importance of overseeing repairs personally before he could in good conscience depart. Alara suspected, though she did not say so aloud, that his reasons for staying extended somewhat beyond simple duty, and the thought both warmed and terrified her in equal measure. Whatever had begun growing between them over these strange, dangerous days felt increasingly undeniable, yet the reality of who he truly was, the crown waiting for him in the capital, the responsibilities that would eventually pull him away from this small border village, regardless of how much either of them might wish otherwise, hung over every stolen moment like a shadow neither could fully ignore. It was on the 4th evening after the battle, as the last light of sunset painted the village in warm gold, that Cade finally found her alone, sitting on the same stone wall where they had talked beneath the stars only days before, though it felt now like a different lifetime entirely. He settled beside her without a word, and for a while they simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky shift slowly toward twilight. "The council has sent another messenger," he said eventually, his voice carrying a weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. "They insist I return within the week, regardless of the village's continuing needs. Apparently my prolonged absence is creating instability they can no longer ignore." Ilara's chest tightened at his words, though she had known, on some level, that this moment was coming since the very beginning. "Then you should go," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the ache the words caused. "A kingdom cannot function properly without its ruler, Cade. Thornhollow will manage. We have survived worse than this before, and we will survive whatever comes next as well." "That is not the part that concerns me most," Cade said quietly, turning to look at her directly, something raw and uncertain flickering behind his usually guarded eyes. "Alara, these past days, everything that has happened between us, I do not know how to simply return to the capital and leave that behind, as though it meant nothing." Her breath caught at the vulnerability in his admission, and for a moment she could not find any words adequate to the tangle of hope and fear knotting together in her chest. "What are you asking me, Cade?" she said finally, needing the clarity, even as part of her feared what his answer might mean for the careful, ordinary life she had built for herself in this village. "I do not fully know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I only know that the thought of returning to the capital without you feels like abandoning something I am not ready to lose. Not after everything we have survived together, not after finally finding someone who sees me as simply a man, rather than a crown, or a symbol, or a mistake to be endlessly forgiven. I have not felt that in longer than I can remember, Alara, and I am terrified of losing it the moment I ride away from this village." Alara stared at him, her heart pounding with an intensity that had nothing to do with fear of enemies, or storms, or broken bridges, and everything to do with the terrifying, exhilarating possibility unfolding before her. "I cannot simply leave Thornhollow," she said slowly, working through the tangle of her own feelings even as she spoke them aloud. "This village is my home, Cade. Everyone I have left in this world is here. The healer who took me in, old Maud, the people I have spent my entire life trying to help rebuild what the war took from us. I do not know how to walk away from that, even for you." "I am not asking you to walk away from it," Cade said, leaning forward with an earnestness that made her chest ache. "I would never ask that of you, Alara, but perhaps there is a way forward that does not require either of us abandoning what matters most. The capital is not so far that visits could not be frequent, and Thornhollow, given everything that has happened here, given its strategic position along the border, could benefit greatly from a more direct connection to the crown, one that ensures a tragedy like the one during the war never repeats itself here again." Alara studied him carefully, understanding slowly dawning as she began to grasp the shape of what he was suggesting, tentative and uncertain as it still remained. "You are suggesting some kind of official role," she said slowly. "A liaison between the village and the crown." "Among other possibilities," Cade said, and something in the careful way he said it made her suspect there was more he was not yet ready to voice fully, some deeper hope he was still working up the courage to name outright. "I do not want to rush you into anything, Alara, particularly not so soon after everything this village has just endured. I only wanted you to know that whatever happens when I eventually return to the capital, I do not intend for it to mean the end of whatever this is between us, not if you are willing to explore where it might lead, at whatever pace feels right to you." The sincerity in his voice, the careful respect for her own autonomy woven through every word, settled something anxious in Alara's chest, and she found herself reaching for his hand, without fully deciding to, lacing her fingers through his in the fading evening light. "I am willing," she said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I do not know exactly what this will look like, Cade, or how we navigate everything that stands between a border village healer and a king's attention, but I am not willing to let fear of complications keep me from finding out." Something in his expression broke open at her words, relief and joy and a tenderness that took her breath away, all mingling together, as he lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "Then we will figure it out together," he said softly, "one careful step at a time, exactly as we have managed everything else since that storm first brought us together." They sat together as the last light faded fully from the sky, stars beginning to scatter across the darkening canvas above, and for the first time since the chaos of the past several days had begun, Alara allowed herself to simply feel hope, quiet and fragile, but undeniably present, for whatever strange, uncertain future now stretched ahead of them both. Whatever challenges still awaited, whatever distance the crown might eventually place between them, she found herself trusting, with a certainty that surprised her, that they would find their way through it, exactly as they had found their way through every danger since the night she first ran through a storm, to save a stranger she never could have guessed would come to matter so completely to her entire world. Their quiet moment did not last long. A sharp call from across the square broke the peace, Garrick's voice carrying an urgency that immediately set Alara's nerves on edge again, and both she and Cade rose quickly, hurrying toward the sound. They found Garrick standing outside the makeshift holding cell, where the captured scout from the first attack remained under guard, his expression grim in the torchlight. "The prisoner finally talked," Garrick said without preamble as they approached. "Under pressure of the battle's outcome, he has given us more than we expected." It seems Malric Draven had help planning his approach, someone within Thornhollow itself who provided information about the village's defenses and the layout of the roads. A cold shock rippled through Alara at the words. "A spy," she said slowly. "Someone from the village." The scout named no one specifically, Garrick admitted, but he confirmed that someone here had been in contact with Malric's forces for weeks before the attack, feeding them details no outsider could have known, including the timing of the bridge's collapse and the fact that the far warning marker had never been replaced. Cade's expression darkened considerably at this new information, and Alara felt a fresh chill settle over her as she thought back over the past several days, searching her memory for anything, any small detail, that might point toward betrayal among people she had known and trusted her entire life. Who would have access to that kind of information? She asked quietly. That is precisely what we intend to determine, Cade said, his voice hard with a resolve that reminded Alara sharply of the commander he must have been during the war, before guilt and exile had softened the edges of that authority. Garrick, I want a full accounting of anyone who has left the village or received unusual visitors in the past month. Someone here betrayed their neighbors to a man responsible for untold suffering during the war, and I intend to find out exactly who, before they have the chance to cause further harm. The investigation that followed consumed the better part of the following 2 days, Garrick and his guards moving quietly through the village, questioning families, tracing the movements of anyone whose behavior had seemed even slightly unusual in recent weeks. Alara found herself unable to fully settle during this time. The knowledge that someone she likely knew, someone who had perhaps sat beside her at the inn or nodded to her in the square, had willingly endangered the entire village for reasons she could not begin to fathom. The truth, when it finally surfaced, came as a painful shock that rippled through the entire community. Edwin, a quiet farmer who had lived at the edge of the village for as long as Alara could remember, was discovered to have been secretly meeting with agents connected to Malric Draven's forces. Motivated, it emerged during questioning, by a debt of vengeance tied to his own family's losses during the war, a grievance twisted over years of isolation into a willingness to betray the very community that had continued to support him despite his growing bitterness. The revelation devastated the village in ways the attack itself had not quite managed, the sense of violated trust cutting deeper than physical danger ever could. Edwin was taken into custody by Garrick's guards, his fate to be determined by proper judgment once matters had settled, and Thornhollow was left to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that danger had come not only from beyond its walls, but from within them as well. It is a hard thing, Cade said to Alara that evening, as they walked together along the quiet lane leading toward Old Maud's cottage, to learn that grief can curdle into something so destructive, even in someone who once belonged to a community meant to heal it. War leaves wounds that do not always close cleanly, Alara said softly, thinking of her own grief, carefully tended over the years into something closer to acceptance rather than bitterness, though she understood, painfully, how easily that balance might have tipped the other way under different circumstances. I am grateful, at least, that we found the truth before it could cause further harm. Cade nodded, though his expression remained troubled. It is one more reason I cannot simply return to the capital and forget what has happened here, he said. This village needs more than temporary reinforcement, Alara. It needs lasting protection and lasting healing, the kind that only comes from the Crown finally paying proper attention to the border communities it has too often left to fend for themselves. Then perhaps, Alara said, reaching for his hand as they walked, that is exactly the kind of change worth building together, whatever shape it eventually takes. He squeezed her hand gently in response, and though the shadow of Edwin's betrayal lingered heavily over the village in the days that followed, something steady and hopeful had settled between Alara and Cade despite it, a quiet resolve to face whatever difficult truths still waited ahead, together, rather than alone. The morning of Cade's departure arrived far sooner than Alara felt prepared for, gray light spreading slowly across a village, still bearing the visible marks of battle, though life had begun, slowly and stubbornly, to return to something resembling its normal rhythm. She stood near the village gate alongside Garrick, Hollis, and a small gathering of villagers who had come to see their king off, watching as guards made final preparations for the journey back toward the capital. Cade approached her separately from the formal farewells, drawing her a short distance away from the gathered crowd, his expression carrying the same careful uncertainty she had seen the night he first admitted how much their connection meant to him. "This is not goodbye," he said quietly, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said, Alara. I intend to arrange matters properly, to find a way for Thornhollow, and for you, to have a lasting place in the Crown's attention, not simply as an afterthought of gratitude, but as something permanent and meaningful." "I believe you," Alara said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she truly did, despite every reasonable doubt that might have warned her against trusting so completely in the promises of a king, with an entire kingdom's worth of complications waiting to reclaim his attention. "Just do not disappear into that palace, and forget the village that helped remind you why the crown is worth carrying in the first place." "I could never forget that," Cade said, his voice low and sincere. Nor could I forget the woman who taught me that lesson in the first place. He leaned forward then, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, lingering just long enough that Alara felt her heart clench with the bittersweet ache of a farewell she had known. Deep down, was always going to eventually arrive, however much she had hoped to delay it. "Write to me," she said softly, as he finally pulled back. "I want to know how you are managing, truly, not simply the formal reports Garrick's messengers usually carry. Every week," Cade promised. "I will write every single week, and I expect equally honest letters in return. Alara Voss. Exactly the kind of honesty that first made me trust you on that ridge road, storm-soaked and furious at me for nearly riding to my own death." Despite the ache of the coming separation, Alara found herself laughing softly at the memory, and Cade's answering smile carried a warmth that she held on to carefully as she watched him finally mount his horse and turn to address the gathered village one last time, offering formal thanks for their courage and their sacrifice, promising that Thornhollow's needs would not be forgotten once he returned to the capital. Then, with Garrick and the royal guard falling into formation around him, he rode out through the village gate, and Alara watched until the last glimpse of him disappeared beyond the tree line, an ache settling in her chest that felt entirely different from any grief she had carried before, hopeful rather than hollow, though no less difficult to bear. The weeks that followed proved busier than Alara expected, the village slowly rebuilding under a renewed sense of purpose. The eastern wall, reinforced with proper stonework, rather than the hasty barriers thrown up before the battle. The bridge over Hollow Creek finally repaired by a crew of royal engineers sent specifically for that purpose. A gesture Alara suspected carried Cade's personal influence behind it, given how directly it addressed the very danger that had first brought them together. True to his word, letters arrived regularly, carried by tired but reliable royal messengers, filled with details of council meetings and palace politics, that Alara found herself genuinely fascinated by, alongside softer, more personal passages that made her cheeks warm even reading them alone in the quiet of old Maud's cottage. The council, Cade wrote honestly, had not received news of his growing attachment to a border village healer with universal enthusiasm. Some among the older advisors worried openly about the political complications of a king's romantic attention falling on someone outside the traditional noble houses that had long provided marriage alliances for the crown, while others expressed concern that his continued focus on Thornhollow's needs represented an inappropriate distraction from broader matters of state. Cade did not shy away from sharing these frustrations with her, and Alara appreciated the honesty, even as it stirred worry about the obstacles still standing between whatever future they might hope to build together. More concerning still were the reports that continued trickling in regarding Malric Draven, who despite his defeat at Thornhollow had not been captured, his remaining forces scattering into the wild border territories where pursuit proved difficult and inconclusive. Cade's letters grew increasingly guarded whenever the topic arose, and Alara sensed, reading between the careful lines of his usual openness, that the threat remained very much alive, simply biding its time, rather than truly extinguished. It was nearly 2 months after Cade's departure that the letters suddenly stopped arriving on their usual schedule, a gap of silence that stretched from 1 week into 2, then into a third, leaving Alara increasingly anxious, despite Garrick's occasional reports confirming that the king remained safe, simply consumed by matters too urgent and sensitive to detail in regular correspondence. The vague reassurances did little to ease her worry, and by the time a royal messenger finally arrived at Thornhollow bearing an urgent summons rather than another letter, Alara's nerves had stretched thin enough that her hands trembled slightly as she broke the official seal. The message, written in Garrick's careful hand rather than Cade's familiar script, requested her immediate presence at the capital, citing matters of urgent importance related to ongoing threats against the crown that required information only she could provide, given her intimate knowledge of the border territories and the events surrounding Malric Draven's initial attack. The formal, urgent tone of the request left Alara with a knot of dread twisting in her stomach that no amount of careful reasoning could fully dispel. "You should go," old Maud said firmly, when Alara showed her the summons that evening, worry evident despite her attempt at outward calm. "Whatever this concerns, girl, hiding here and imagining the worst will serve no one. Go to the capital, learn the truth, and trust that whatever you find there, you have already proven yourself capable of facing far worse than palace politics." Elara knew Maud was right, though the prospect of leaving Thornhollow, of stepping into a world so far removed from the quiet, familiar rhythms of her entire life, filled her with an anxiety she had not felt since the earliest days after her family's death, when everything familiar had suddenly been stripped away without warning. Still, she packed what few belongings she thought necessary, arranged for the village healer to manage without her assistance, for however long the journey required, and set out the following morning, alongside the small escort Garrick had sent specifically to guide her safely to the capital. The journey itself took nearly 4 days, the landscape shifting gradually from the familiar hills and forests surrounding Thornhollow into more populated territory, farms giving way eventually to larger towns, the roads growing wider and busier the closer they drew to the capital itself. Elara found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the scale of it all. The sheer size of the kingdom she had only ever known through stories and rumors, and by the time the capital's walls finally rose into view on the 4th day, gleaming white stone stretching far higher and wider than anything in her previous experience, she felt distinctly out of her depth, a border village healer arriving in a world built for kings and nobles, rather than herbalists and orphaned farm girls. The escort guided her through the bustling capital streets toward the palace itself, and Elara found herself gripping the edge of her seat as the carriage passed through increasingly grand gates, past guards in polished armor, past gardens more elaborate than anything she had ever imagined, until finally they arrived at the palace's main entrance, where, to her considerable surprise and relief, Garrick himself stood waiting to greet her, his expression grave despite the evident warmth in his eyes at seeing her again. "Elara," he said, helping her down from the carriage with careful courtesy. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I apologize for the abruptness of the summons, but circumstances have grown considerably more complicated than we anticipated, and time is not a luxury we currently possess." "What has happened?" Elara asked immediately, her earlier anxiety sharpening into focused alertness. "Where is Cade? Why did he not write himself?" Garrick's expression tightened, a flicker of something grim passing behind his eyes before he composed himself enough to answer. "His Grace is currently unharmed," he said carefully, choosing his words with obvious deliberation. "But he has been consumed these past weeks with a threat that has grown considerably more dangerous than we initially understood. Malric Draven did not simply retreat after his defeat at Thornhollow, Elara. He has spent the intervening months building alliances with other disaffected factions across the kingdom, and intelligence suggests he now intends a direct strike against the capital itself, timed to coincide with an important council gathering in only a few days' time." Cold dread settled deep in Elara's chest at the revelation, memories of the battle at Thornhollow rising sharp and unwelcome in her mind. "Why summon me specifically?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer even before Garrick spoke it. "Because during our investigation into Edwin's betrayal, and through subsequent intelligence gathered since, we have learned that Malric's network of informants extends further than we initially believed, potentially even within the palace itself," Garrick said grimly. "His Grace believes, and I share this belief, that your outsider's perspective, combined with your proven instinct for recognizing danger others might overlook, could prove invaluable in identifying the threat before it strikes. That, and quite frankly, Elara, he has missed you terribly these past weeks, though he would likely be embarrassed to hear me admit that so plainly." Despite the gravity of the situation, a small, warm flicker of relief passed through Elara at those last words, quickly overtaken again by the seriousness of what Garrick had described. "Take me to him," she said firmly. "Whatever is happening, whatever danger is gathering against this capital, I want to understand it fully, and I want to help however I possibly can." Garrick nodded, clearly expecting nothing less, and led her through the sprawling grandeur of the palace, past hallways lined with portraits of kings long dead, past guards who straightened to sharp attention at their captain's approach, until finally they reached a set of heavy wooden doors that opened into a private study, where Cade stood bent over a table covered in maps and reports, his expression drawn with an exhaustion that spoke of weeks of insufficient sleep and mounting worry. He looked up as they entered, and the moment his eyes found Elara, something in his exhausted expression broke open with such raw relief and longing that she crossed the room toward him, without a second thought, meeting him halfway, as he pulled her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could, of exactly how much he had missed her these past silent weeks. "I am sorry I did not write," he murmured against her hair, holding her tightly enough that she could feel the tension still coiled through his entire body. "Everything happened so quickly, and I did not want to alarm you with half-formed suspicions before we understood the true scope of what we were facing." "I am here now," Elara said, pulling back just enough to study his face properly, noting the new lines of worry etched around his eyes, the weariness that suggested weeks of crisis management with far too little rest. "Tell me everything, Cade. Whatever this threat is, I want to understand it completely, and I want to help you face it, exactly as I have helped you face every danger since that storm first brought us together." Something in his expression softened at her words, gratitude and relief mingling with the fierce determination that had carried him through every crisis since his return from exile. And as he began explaining the full scope of Malric Draven's growing conspiracy, the alliances forged with disaffected nobles and border factions alike, the planned strike against the upcoming council gathering that threatened to plunge the entire kingdom back into the kind of chaos and violence that had already stolen so much from both of their lives, Elara felt the same fierce resolve she had carried through the battle at Thornhollow settling firmly back into place. Whatever danger still lay ahead, whatever complicated politics and hidden conspiracies threatened the fragile peace they had both fought so hard to protect, she intended to face it standing beside him, exactly as she always had since the very first night she ran through a storm to warn a stranger about a broken bridge that had, in ways neither of them could have possibly predicted, ended up rebuilding both their lives entirely. Over the following hours, Cade laid out everything his intelligence network had gathered, spreading reports and maps across the study table, while Elara listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed instincts honed by years of careful observation, in a village where survival often depended on noticing small details others might overlook. Malric Draven, it seemed, had spent the month since his defeat quietly courting several minor noble houses along the kingdom's northern border, families who had suffered financial hardship during the long years of war, and felt neglected by a crown more focused on rebuilding the capital than addressing their struggles. "He is offering them what the crown has failed to provide," Cade explained grimly, tracing a finger along a map marking the territories in question. "Promises of restored wealth and influence, in exchange for support during whatever strike he intends against the council gathering. It is a strategy built on genuine grievances, which makes it considerably more dangerous than simple brute force alone. Then perhaps addressing those grievances directly would undermine his support more effectively than simply hunting him down," Elara suggested, and Cade looked up at her with an expression of surprised consideration, as though the suggestion had not fully occurred to him amid the urgency of tracking Malric's movements. "You may be right," he admitted slowly. "I have been so focused on the immediate threat that I have not adequately considered the deeper causes feeding it. If we can demonstrate genuine commitment to those neglected territories, publicly and swiftly, it may pull the ground out from beneath Malric's remaining alliances before they can fully solidify." Garrick, who had remained near the door throughout their discussion, cleared his throat thoughtfully. "There is still the matter of the informant within the palace," he reminded them. "Whatever strategy we pursue regarding the northern houses, we still face the immediate danger of the council gathering itself, and someone close enough to the crown to know its schedule and security arrangements in detail." The reminder settled a fresh weight of urgency over the room, and for the next several days, Elara found herself drawn fully into the palace's careful, quiet investigation, her outsider's perspective proving valuable exactly as Cade had hoped. She noticed things the palace guards, accustomed to the routine rhythms of court life, had grown too familiar to properly question. A servant who lingered too long near private council chambers, a minor clerk whose recent spending seemed inconsistent with his modest salary, small details that, pieced together carefully over several tense days, eventually pointed toward a junior advisor within the Treasury office who had, it emerged under careful questioning, been feeding information to Malric's network in exchange for promises of advancement once the conspiracy succeeded in destabilizing the current council. The advisor's arrest, conducted quietly to avoid alerting any remaining conspirators, provided crucial information about the planned strike's timing and method, confirming that Malric intended to use the chaos of a public council gathering to stage a direct assault aimed at eliminating key supporters of the crown, while creating enough confusion to seize temporary control of the capital's outer districts. Armed with this knowledge, Cade and his advisors began quietly repositioning guard forces and adjusting the gathering's security arrangements, all while maintaining the outward appearance that nothing had changed, hoping to lure Malric's forces into a confrontation on terms far more favorable to the crown than the chaos he had originally planned. Through it all, Alara remained close beside Cade, her presence a steadying influence amid the mounting tension, and though the days grew increasingly fraught with the weight of what was coming, she found unexpected comfort in the quiet moments they still managed to steal together. Late evenings spent walking through the palace gardens, sharing meals away from the formal scrutiny of the court, rebuilding the closeness that weeks of separation and silence had strained without ever truly breaking. Whatever confrontation still awaited them, she understood, with growing certainty, that they would face it exactly as they had faced every danger before, together, and unwilling to let fear determine the outcome of a fight that mattered too much to lose. The day of the council gathering arrived beneath a sky so clear and bright, it felt almost mocking against the tension coiled tightly through the palace grounds. Alara stood near the edge of the great hall, where the gathering would take place, dressed in a simple but formal gown Garrick's wife had insisted on providing for the occasion. Her nerves stretched taut, despite the careful preparations that had consumed the past several days. Cade caught her eye briefly from across the hall, where he stood receiving formal greetings from arriving nobles and council members, his expression composed and confident, despite the danger both of them knew lurked somewhere beyond the hall's grand doors. Garrick had positioned additional guards throughout the grounds, disguised among the palace staff and gardeners, ready to respond the moment any sign of Malric's planned assault revealed itself. Though the waiting, the uncertainty of not knowing exactly when or how the attack might come, stretched every nerve in Alara's body toward breaking point. The gathering proceeded for nearly an hour with deceptive normalcy, council members delivering reports, minor matters of state discussed with the same measured formality Alara imagined had governed such occasions for generations, and she found herself beginning to wonder if perhaps their intelligence had been wrong, if Malric had somehow learned his plans were compromised and abandoned the assault entirely. That fragile hope shattered the moment a loud crash echoed from the hall's eastern entrance, followed immediately by shouts of alarm and the unmistakable clash of weapons meeting weapons. Chaos erupted through the great hall as council members and nobles scrambled for the exits, guards moving swiftly to intercept a group of armed intruders who had apparently breached the eastern entrance despite the heightened security, their intent clearly focused on cutting a direct path toward the raised dais where Cade had been standing only moments before. Alara's heart lurched with terror as she lost sight of him in the swirling chaos, guards and nobles pushing past each other in desperate attempts to reach safety, the elegant formality of the gathering collapsing entirely into violent disorder. She fought against the tide of fleeing bodies rather than with it, driven by a desperate need to find Cade amid the chaos, her healer's instincts already anticipating the injuries that would inevitably follow this confrontation. She caught sight of Garrick near the dais, sword drawn, directing guards with sharp, urgent commands, and pushed her way toward him, ignoring the danger of the fighting still raging nearby. "Where is Cade?" she demanded, grabbing Garrick's arm the moment she reached him. "He went after Malric directly," Garrick said grimly, gesturing toward a side corridor where several guards had already disappeared in pursuit. The man himself led this assault, Alara. "He is here, in the palace," and Cade would not wait for a proper response force once he recognized him among the attackers. Fear seized Alara's chest at the news, memories of Malric's cold, calculating presence during the pursuit through the northern forest, rising sharp and unwelcome in her mind. Without fully deciding to, she found herself moving toward the same corridor, ignoring Garrick's sharp call of warning behind her, driven by the same fierce instinct that had once sent her running alone through a storm to save a stranger she barely knew existed. The corridor beyond the great hall was narrower, quieter, the sounds of the ongoing chaos muffled behind heavy doors, and Alara moved carefully, following the faint sounds of confrontation drifting from somewhere ahead. She rounded a corner just in time to see Cade locked in fierce combat with a broad-shouldered figure she recognized immediately, even without a clear view of his face, from the cold, calculated menace radiating from every controlled movement. Malric Draven fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent years honing his skills through conflict, and Alara watched with her heart in her throat as he pressed Cade backward with a series of aggressive strikes, forcing him toward the corridor's dead end, where ornate windows overlooked the palace gardens far below. Cade fought back with equal skill, though exhaustion and the accumulated stress of recent weeks seemed to be taking their toll. his movements growing marginally slower with each exchanged blow. Elara searched desperately for something, anything, that might help tip the balance of the fight, her eyes catching on a heavy ceremonial vase, resting on a nearby pedestal. Without allowing herself time to fully consider the danger, she grabbed it and hurled it with all the strength she possessed toward Malric's exposed side, the heavy ceramic shattering against his shoulder, with enough force to stagger him, breaking his concentration, at exactly the critical moment Cade needed to press his own advantage. Malric's furious gaze snapped toward her, cold fury replacing his previous focused calm, and for one terrifying moment, Elara feared she had simply redirected his violence toward herself instead. But Cade used the distraction ruthlessly, closing the distance with a final, decisive strike that sent Malric's weapon clattering to the floor, followed swiftly by guards finally arriving to properly restrain him before he could recover enough to pose further danger. The fight ended almost as quickly as it had begun. Malric Draven finally captured and disarmed, his forces throughout the palace grounds gradually subdued as Garrick's positioned guards responded to the chaos with the coordinated efficiency of careful preparation. Elara found herself trembling in the aftermath, adrenaline slowly draining from her body as Cade crossed the corridor toward her, his expression a complicated mixture of relief and something close to exasperated affection. "You threw a vase at him," he said, disbelief coloring his voice, despite the evident relief in his eyes. "It worked, did it not?" Elara said, her voice slightly unsteady despite her attempt at dry humor. Cade let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a shudder of released tension, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything neither of them had time to properly voice amid the chaos of the past several minutes. "You are going to be the death of me," he murmured against her hair, though his tone carried far more affection than genuine complaint. Running toward every danger rather than away from it. "You are hardly one to talk," Elara said, though she allowed herself to lean fully into his embrace, grateful beyond words that both of them had survived yet another confrontation that could easily have ended in tragedy. Around them, the palace slowly began the difficult work of accounting for the chaos, tending to the injured, securing the captured conspirators, restoring order to grounds that only an hour before had held nothing more threatening than formal council proceedings. As the immediate danger finally began to settle into something like resolution, Elara found herself hoping, fiercely and with a certainty she had not quite dared to feel before, that Malric Draven's capture might finally mark the true end of a threat that had shaped both of their lives so profoundly since the very night a broken bridge first brought them unexpectedly together. The hours that followed the attack passed in a blur of urgent, necessary work. Elara moved through the palace's makeshift medical wing alongside the royal physicians, tending to guards and staff injured during the chaos, her hands steady despite the lingering tremor of adrenaline still coursing beneath her calm exterior. The injuries proved less severe than she had initially feared, thanks largely to Garrick's careful preparation and the swift response of the guards positioned throughout the grounds, though several would require weeks of careful recovery before returning fully to their duties. It was well into the evening before Elara finally found a moment to rest, seated on a bench in a quiet corridor near the medical wing, exhaustion settling heavily over her now that the urgent work had finally slowed. Cade found her there, having spent the intervening hours overseeing Malric's formal imprisonment and beginning the delicate process of questioning the captured conspirators about the full scope of their network. "How is he?" Elara asked, though she was not entirely certain she wanted to know the details of Malric Draven's fate. "Secured, and considerably less defiant than I expected," Cade said, settling onto the bench beside her, with the particular heaviness of a man who had spent the day carrying burdens far beyond simple physical exhaustion. "It seems capture without the glory of martyrdom has a way of loosening a man's tongue, rather more than threats ever could. He has already named several of the northern nobles involved in his conspiracy, along with details of how deeply his network extended before today." "Will it be over now?" Elara asked quietly. "Truly over? Or will there simply be another Malric Draven waiting somewhere beyond the next border in a few years' time?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful seriousness he applied to every decision she had watched him make since the night they first met. "I do not know if any kingdom is ever truly free from the possibility of such threats," he admitted finally. "But I intend to address the grievances that made his conspiracy possible in the first place, rather than simply defeating this one threat and declaring the matter closed. The Northern Territories, the border villages like Thorn Hollow, they deserve better than being remembered only when danger forces the Crown's attention toward them. That is a mistake I do not intend to repeat. Alara studied his profile in the dim corridor light, seeing in his exhausted but resolute expression the same man who had stood before Thorn Hollow's gathered elders weeks before, promising to stay and defend a village he had known for less than a single night. Whatever crown he carried, whatever weight of duty and guilt still shaped his choices, she found herself trusting, more completely than she had trusted almost anything in her life since losing her family, that he meant every word of that promise. Then perhaps, she said softly, this conspiracy, terrible as it has been, will end up serving some good after all, if it finally forces the changes that villages like mine have needed for years. Cade turned to look at her then, something warm and grateful flickering behind his tired eyes, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. I could not have found my way to any of this clarity without you, he said quietly. Not the courage to return from exile, not the strength to face this conspiracy honestly, and certainly not the understanding of what true partnership actually looks like. You have changed everything, Alara, more than I think you fully realize. I think, Alara said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through her exhaustion, that we have changed each other in fairly equal measure, Cade Ashbourne. That seems only fair, given how it all began. He laughed softly at that, the sound carrying genuine warmth despite the weight of the day behind them, and for a while, they simply sat together in the quiet corridor, hands intertwined, drawing comfort from each other's presence, as the palace slowly settled around them, into the uneasy calm that follows crisis. Both of them aware that whatever difficult work still remained in the aftermath of Malric's conspiracy, they would face it exactly as they had faced everything else, together, and stronger for having survived the storm that first brought them to this unlikely, precious place. The weeks following Malric Draven's capture brought sweeping changes to the kingdom, changes that Alara watched unfold, with a mixture of pride and quiet astonishment at how thoroughly one dangerous conspiracy had managed to reshape the Crown's priorities. Cade moved swiftly, once the immediate crisis had settled, presenting the council with a comprehensive plan to address the grievances that had made Malric's alliances possible in the first place: increased investment in the northern border territories, formal recognition and support for villages like Thorn Hollow that had suffered disproportionately during the war, and new provisions, ensuring that intelligence about threats along the border would never again languish unheeded, the way it apparently had in the months before the attack on her own village. The council did not accept these changes without resistance. Alara sat quietly at the edges of several formal sessions during her extended stay at the palace, watching Cade navigate the careful politics of convincing skeptical nobles that investment in distant border territories served the kingdom's broader stability, rather than simply representing a sentimental indulgence toward the village that had captured their king's personal attention. She admired the patient, methodical way he built his arguments, weaving together practical strategic reasoning with the moral weight of the Crown's obligations to all its people, not merely those closest to the capital's comfortable center. It was during one such session, nearly 3 weeks after the attack, that the more personal complications Alara had quietly worried about finally surfaced in open discussion. An older councilman, whose name Alara had learned was Callum Ashgrove, raised the matter with careful, deliberate formality, questioning whether the king's evident personal attachment to a border village healer might be unduly influencing decisions that should properly rest on strategic merit alone. Alara felt her cheeks burn at the pointed reference, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, watching from her seat near the chamber's edge as Cade addressed the challenge directly, without the faintest hint of defensiveness in his measured response. My attachment to Alara Voss, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the formal chamber, has taught me more about this kingdom's true condition than 5 years of careful reports ever managed to convey. If listening to someone with direct experience of border life, rather than relying solely on the comfortable assumptions of the capital, constitutes undue influence, then I confess I consider it exactly the kind of influence this council has needed for far too long. A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the gathered nobles at his frank response, and Alara caught Garrick's small, approving smile from across the chamber, along with several nods of consideration from council members, who had perhaps not previously thought to question their own assumptions quite so directly. Callum Ashgrove, for his part, seemed somewhat taken aback by the directness of the response, though he did not press the matter further, retreating instead into thoughtful silence that suggested Cade's words had at least given him pause. That evening, walking together through the palace gardens as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Ilara finally voiced the worry that had been quietly building throughout the day's session. "Cade, are you certain this is worth the political complication? I do not want to become a permanent source of friction between you and the council you need to govern effectively." Cade stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the shade of a flowering tree, whose scent carried sweetly on the evening breeze. "Ilara," he said seriously, "I spent 5 years running from responsibility, because I did not trust myself to lead well. These past months, with you beside me, I have finally begun to trust that judgment again, not despite your influence, but specifically because of it. I am not willing to sacrifice that clarity simply to avoid uncomfortable conversations with council members who have grown too comfortable with the old way of doing things." "That is a very diplomatic way of saying you intend to keep arguing with stubborn old nobles on my behalf," Ilara said, a smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. "Precisely that," Cade said, his own smile warming his tired features. "And I intend to keep doing it for as long as it takes, Ilara, because you matter to me, and because the changes we are fighting for matter to this entire kingdom, not simply to the two of us." Something in the certainty of his voice settled the last of Ilara's lingering worry, and she reached up to gently cup his face, drawing him down into a kiss that felt like both a promise and a culmination of everything unspoken between them since the very night a storm first brought them together. When they finally parted, Cade rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them breathing slightly unsteadily in the fading evening light. "I have something to ask you," he said softly, and something in his tone made Ilara's heart begin to pound with a different kind of anticipation entirely. "I have been considering how to properly ask this for weeks now, weighing every possible complication it might create, every argument the council might raise, and I have finally decided that none of those concerns matter nearly as much as the simple truth of what I want for the rest of my life." He drew back just enough to look at her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him even during their most difficult conversations. "Ilara Voss, from the moment you ran through that storm to save a stranger you owed nothing to, you have taught me more about honesty, courage, and true leadership than anyone else in my entire life. I do not want to simply visit Thornhollow occasionally, or arrange some careful political compromise that keeps us at a comfortable distance. I want you beside me, always, as my partner in every sense of the word. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Ilara could not find any words adequate to the overwhelming rush of emotion flooding through her. Joy and disbelief and a fierce, certain love, all tangling together, so completely that she simply nodded, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, even as a wide smile broke across her face. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Cade, of course, yes." His answering smile transformed his entire face, relief and joy radiating from him so completely that Ilara felt the last of her earlier worries dissolve entirely, replaced by a certainty that whatever political complications still lay ahead, whatever careful conversations with skeptical council members remained necessary, they would face all of it together, exactly as they had faced every danger since that first fateful storm. He pulled her into his arms, spinning her once in a rare display of pure, unguarded happiness before setting her back down and kissing her again, slower this time, savoring the moment with the same careful attention he brought to everything that truly mattered to him. News of their engagement spread through the palace, and eventually through the kingdom itself, with remarkable speed, and while some corners of the court continued to voice quiet reservations about the unconventional match, the broader response, Ilara found with considerable relief, proved far warmer than she had dared hope. Stories of her role in saving the king's life, in defending Thornhollow against Malric Draven's attack, and in helping uncover the palace conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in throwing the kingdom back into chaos, had already spread widely enough that many among the common people viewed the match not as a scandalous overreach, but as a fitting reward for genuine courage and service. Cade insisted, over Ilara's initial hesitant protests, that their wedding take place in Thornhollow itself, rather than the Grand Capital Cathedral, more traditionally associated with royal ceremonies, a decision that drew renewed grumbling from the more traditional council members, but delighted Alara beyond measure, offering as it did, the chance to celebrate this new chapter of her life, surrounded by the community and the home that had shaped her through every previous hardship. Preparations began almost immediately, and within weeks, Alara found herself traveling back toward the village she had left as an anxious, uncertain summons only a season before, returning now with a joy and certainty that felt like an entirely different lifetime, though barely months had actually passed since that fateful night on the storm-swept Ridge Road. Before she departed the capital, Alara insisted on attending the formal proceedings determining Malric Draven's fate, feeling she owed it to herself, and to everyone in Thornhollow who had suffered because of his ambitions, to witness the conclusion of a threat that had shaped so much of the past several months. The trial proved brief, the evidence against him overwhelming, gathered from the testimony of captured conspirators, the physical evidence seized during his arrest, and the accounts of villagers and guards who had survived his attacks both at Thornhollow and within the palace itself. Malric showed no remorse throughout the proceedings, his cold, calculating composure never fully cracking, even as the council delivered its judgment, sentencing him to permanent imprisonment within the kingdom's most secure fortress, far from any opportunity to rebuild the alliances that had nearly allowed his conspiracy to succeed. Alara felt no particular satisfaction watching him led away in chains, only a quiet, settled relief that the shadow hanging over both Thornhollow and the capital had finally, truly lifted, allowing everyone touched by his violence to begin the slow work of healing without the constant fear of his return. "It is strange," she admitted to Cade afterward, as they walked together away from the formal chamber where the sentence had been delivered. "I expected to feel more triumphant, somehow, watching him finally face consequences for everything he caused. Instead, I mostly just feel tired and grateful that it is finally over." "Grief and relief rarely arrive as cleanly as stories suggest they should," Cade said gently, taking her hand as they walked. "I have found, since my own return from exile, that closure is rarely the dramatic, final thing we imagine it to be. More often, it is simply the quiet absence of a fear that had grown so familiar we barely noticed carrying it, until suddenly it is gone, and we are left figuring out how to move forward without its weight." Alara considered his words carefully, recognizing in them the same hard-won wisdom that had carried him through his own difficult return to the throne. "Then perhaps that is enough," she said finally. "Simply moving forward, together, without that particular weight dragging behind us any longer." The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparation for their journey back to Thornhollow, Cade delegating enough of his immediate palace responsibilities to Garrick and a trusted council of advisors to allow for several weeks away from the capital, a decision that drew predictable grumbling from the more traditional nobles, but which he defended with the same patient firmness he had shown throughout every challenge to their relationship. Alara spent her final days in the capital sending word ahead to Old Maud and the village elders, her excitement building with every passing hour, despite the underlying nervousness of returning home, not simply as the healer's apprentice who had once run through a storm, but as the woman soon to become the kingdom's queen. The journey back toward Thornhollow felt entirely different from the anxious trip she had made toward the capital weeks before, the familiar landscape unfolding around them, with a warmth that made Alara's chest ache with anticipation, as recognizable landmarks slowly began appearing, the particular curve of the river that marked the boundary of her childhood memories, the distant silhouette of hills she had climbed 100 times gathering herbs, and finally, as their small traveling party crested the final ridge, the village itself came into view, nestled peacefully in its familiar valley, smoke curling gently from chimney after chimney in the crisp afternoon air. Word of their approach had clearly traveled ahead of them, because as they made their way down the final stretch of road toward the village gate, Alara could see a crowd already gathering, villagers pressing forward with evident excitement, despite the formal guards attempting to maintain some semblance of order around the approaching royal party. She caught sight of Hollis near the gate, his weathered face split into a wide, delighted grin, and beside him, unmistakable even at a distance, Old Maud, standing with her arms crossed, in an attempt at dignified composure that did nothing to hide the obvious emotion in her posture. The moment their carriage drew close enough, Alara could not wait for the formal procedures Garrick's guards had carefully planned, practically leaping down before the vehicle had fully stopped, crossing the remaining distance toward Maud, at a run that drew startled laughter from the gathered crowd, and an indulgent, affectionate shake of the head from Cade behind her. Maud met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace fierce enough to nearly knock them both off balance, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply holding on tightly to the reunion neither had fully realized how desperately they needed. "Look at you," Maud said finally, pulling back enough to study Alara's face with sharp, assessing eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Soon to be a queen, and yet you still run toward an old woman like an overeager child the moment you catch sight of her. Some things, I suppose, never truly change." "I would hope not," Alara said, laughing through the tears that had gathered unexpectedly in her eyes. "Whatever title I carry, Maud, I never intend to become someone who forgets where she came from, or who first taught her how to be strong enough to face it." Maud's expression softened considerably at that, and she reached up to gently cup Alara's face, exactly as she had done countless times since Alara first arrived on her doorstep as a grieving 13-year-old girl, with nowhere else to go. "Your parents would be so proud of you, girl," she said quietly, emotion roughening her usually steady voice. "Whatever else this strange, remarkable journey has brought you, I know that much to be absolutely true." The reunion continued throughout the remainder of the afternoon, villagers crowding forward to offer their own congratulations and welcomes, many of them recounting, with evident pride, their own small roles in the events that had eventually led to this moment: the night of the storm, the battle against Malric's forces, the quiet courage of a community that had refused to abandon either its people or the stranger who had unknowingly walked among them. Cade moved through the crowd with genuine warmth, greeting villagers by name where he remembered them, asking after families and farms with the kind of personal attention that Alara knew, from her time observing him in the capital, was far rarer among rulers than it perhaps should be. As evening settled over the village and the initial excitement of their arrival finally began to ease into quieter, more personal conversations scattered throughout the square, Alara found herself standing once more at the low stone wall, where she and Cade had first begun to acknowledge the depth of what was growing between them, watching the sunset paint familiar hills in shades of gold and rose that felt, somehow, even more beautiful than she remembered. Cade joined her there a short while later, settling beside her with the same easy familiarity that had marked their earliest conversations, though everything between them now carried the deeper certainty of everything they had survived together since. "It feels different, being back here," he observed quietly. "Lighter somehow, despite everything that happened during our last visit." "That is because the danger is finally gone," Alara said, leaning into his side as his arms settled comfortably around her shoulders. "We can simply be here now, together, without wondering what threat might be gathering beyond the ridge." "I like that thought considerably," Cade said, pressing a soft kiss against her temple. "Though I confess, Alara, as much as I have grown to love this village, and as certain as I am about our future together, there remains one more significant event we still need to properly plan before we can fully settle into that peaceful future you describe." "Our wedding," Alara said, a smile spreading across her face. Despite the flutter of nervous anticipation, the word still stirred in her chest. "Our wedding," Cade confirmed, his own smile warm and certain in the fading evening light. "Here, in Thornhollow, surrounded by everyone who helped shape both of our journeys toward this moment. I cannot think of anywhere more fitting to finally, properly begin the rest of our lives together." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, sunlight spilling gently across a village that had spent the past several weeks transforming itself, with a joy and dedication that left Alara constantly moved to fresh tears whenever she paused long enough to fully take in the effort surrounding her. Ribbons and early autumn flowers decorated every lane and doorway. Tables had been set up throughout the square for the celebration feast that would follow the ceremony, and the entire village, alongside a modest but carefully chosen gathering of guests from the capital, had turned out in their finest clothing, faces bright with genuine celebration, rather than mere formal obligation. Alara stood in the small back room of the village chapel, the same modest stone building where she had attended countless ordinary services throughout her childhood, now transformed for this extraordinary occasion into something that felt both deeply familiar and entirely new. Old Maud fussed over the final details of her gown, a simple but elegant creation that had been crafted by the capital's finest seamstresses at Cade's insistence, though Alara had firmly requested it incorporate traditional thorn-hollow embroidery along the hem, small stitched herbs and flowers that represented her own history as clearly as any royal insignia might have. "You look beautiful, girl," Maud said, her voice thick with emotion as she adjusted the final fold of fabric. "Though I suspect you would look beautiful to that man wearing sackcloth, given the way he looks at you." "I certainly hope we never have to test that particular theory," Alara said, laughing, despite the nervous flutter in her stomach, though it was a nervousness born entirely of anticipation rather than doubt. Whatever uncertainty had once colored her feelings about the complicated future stretching before her, standing here now, moments away from formally beginning her life alongside Cade, she felt nothing but a deep, settled certainty that this was exactly the path meant for her. A soft knock at the door announced Hollis, tasked with the honor of escorting her down the aisle, in the absence of the father she had lost so many years before, his weathered face carrying an expression of such evident pride and affection that fresh tears threatened before the ceremony had even properly begun. "Ready, my dear?" he asked gently, offering his arm. "As ready as I will ever be," Alara said, taking a steadying breath before linking her arm through his, and allowing him to lead her from the small back room toward the chapel's main hall, where the assembled guests waited. And beyond them, standing at the front of the modest aisle, Cade himself, dressed simply but formally, his expression the moment he caught sight of her transforming into something so openly, vulnerably joyful, that it stole whatever remaining breath the morning's nervousness had left her. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of familiar words and quiet emotion, the village priest who had known Alara since her earliest childhood, presiding with the same gentle warmth he had shown throughout every difficult season of her life, guiding them both through vows that felt, despite their traditional structure, entirely personal and true to everything they had built together since that first fateful storm. When Cade finally slipped a simple, elegant ring onto her finger, and she did the same for him, the small chapel erupted into joyful applause and cheering that seemed to carry the accumulated relief and happiness of an entire village that had weathered so much together over the past several months. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, the village square filled with music and dancing, tables groaning under the weight of a feast that Petra and the other village women had spent days preparing, and Alara found herself moving through the joyful chaos with a lightness of heart she had not felt since long before the war first stole her family from her. She danced with Cade beneath strings of lanterns that cast warm golden light across the celebrating crowd, laughed with Garrick as he recounted, with considerable exaggeration, the story of Alara throwing a ceremonial vase at Malric Draven during their final confrontation, and found herself, more than once throughout the evening, simply pausing to marvel at the sheer improbable joy of everything that had unfolded since the night she first ran through a storm to warn a stranger about a broken bridge. Late in the evening, as the celebration finally began to quiet, and many of the older guests retired for the night, Alara found herself once more standing at the low stone wall, overlooking the fields beyond the village. Cade's arm settled comfortably around her shoulders, as they watched stars slowly scatter across the darkening sky above. "Do you remember," Cade said softly, "what you told me that very first night, before either of us understood what the other truly meant to us? You said anyone would have done the same, running through that storm to save a stranger." "I remember," Alara said, smiling at the memory of her own younger certainty, "though I think I have come to understand over these past months that perhaps not everyone truly would have. It takes a particular kind of person to run toward danger rather than away from it." "I think," Cade said, turning to look at her with an expression carrying all the warmth and certainty that had grown between them since that stormy night, "it takes exactly the kind of person you have always been, Alara Ashbourne, whether tending wounds in a quiet border village or standing beside a king, facing down conspiracies that threatened an entire kingdom. That courage, that fierce, stubborn honesty, it is precisely what I fell in love with, and precisely what I intend to spend the rest of my life grateful for." Alara felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it nearly ached, and she leaned into him fully, resting her head against his shoulder, as they continued watching the stars scatter their light across the peaceful village below. A village that had survived war and betrayal and violent conspiracy, and had emerged from all of it stronger, more connected to the crown that had once felt so distant, and filled, on this particular joyful evening, with nothing but celebration and hope for whatever future still lay ahead. "I love you, Cade," she said softly, the words carrying all the certainty of everything they had built together since that first desperate run through the storm. "Whatever comes next, whatever challenges still wait for us, king and healer both, I am endlessly grateful that a broken bridge brought you into my life exactly when it did." "As am I," Cade murmured against her hair, holding her close beneath the vast, star-scattered sky. "More grateful than I could ever properly express, for the woman who saw past every title and every guarded wall I carried, and simply chose to save a stranger, because it was the right thing to do." They remained there together for a long while, wrapped in comfortable silence, and the quiet, settled joy of a love that had been tested by storms and battles and conspiracies alike, and had emerged from every trial only stronger and more certain. Behind them, Thornhollow slept peacefully beneath the star-scattered sky, its rebuilt bridge standing solid and secure over Hollow Creek, a quiet symbol of everything the village, and the two people now bound together at its heart, had overcome, to finally reach this moment of hard-won, deeply deserved peace. In the years that followed, stories of that stormy night would be told and retold throughout the kingdom, growing gradually into something closer to legend, the tale of a humble village healer who had unknowingly saved the life of her returning king, and in doing so, had helped guide an entire kingdom back toward the kind of compassionate, attentive leadership it had desperately needed, since long before either of them had ever crossed paths on that dark, storm-swept ridge road. But for Alara and Cade themselves, the story remained something far simpler and more precious than any legend, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage and kindness, offered freely to a stranger without any expectation of return, could ultimately reshape not only two individual lives, but the fate of an entire kingdom, standing quietly, hopefully, on the edge of a brighter and more connected future.